Hey everyone, welcome to Nightmare Scene. Before we begin, I'd love to know, which city are you listening from as you hear these spine-chilling stories? Leave a comment to let me know. Alright, now take a deep breath. Let's begin. I've always enjoyed hiking, especially in remote places. This summer, I decided to push myself by going camping in a secluded national forest. This forest had a reputation among hikers for being mysterious. People said it was undisturbed by civilization, a perfect place to find peace. It sounded like exactly what I was looking for. When I arrived, it was already late in the afternoon. I registered my information at the visitor center, telling them I planned to stay for 2 nights, then parked my car in a small, primitive lot. After that, I started down a narrow path, barely visible beneath the overgrown bushes and branches. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the occasional bird call breaking the stillness. That kind of silence was unsettling, but I brushed it off, picking up my pace. After about 2 hours of walking, I found a clearing that seemed ideal for setting up camp. By then it was getting dark, so I quickly pitched my tent and lit a campfire. The trees around me cast long, eerie shadows in the flickering firelight. I tried to relax, preparing a simple meal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound. It was subtle, but in the stillness of the forest, it stood out. It sounded like footsteps slowly moving through the leaves. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam of light swept across the trees, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a fox. After all, this was the wilderness. Animals were everywhere. But the unease lingered. I sat back down by the fire, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. You know that sensation, the one where you feel someone's eyes on you, even though you can't see them? It was that creeping up my spine. I scanned the trees with my peripheral vision, but nothing moved. As the night wore on, I finally crawled into my tent, hoping sleep would come easily. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why, but then I heard it again. Soft footsteps. This time they were closer. It was like someone was walking around my tent, trying to be quiet but failing. I grabbed my flashlight, sitting up in the tent, my heart pounding in my chest, ready to jump out and confront whatever, or whoever, was out there. But the sound suddenly stopped. I waited, listening for any other noises, but after what felt like hours, everything was silent again. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and began to pack up, eager to move further into the forest. As I circled the tent, something caught my eye. Footprints. Clear, human-sized footprints. They circled my tent once and then disappeared into the woods. My blood ran cold. It didn't make sense. How could anyone else be out here in the middle of nowhere? And why had they been sneaking around my camp at night? Determined to shake off the fear, I spent the day hiking deeper into the forest. I found another spot to camp near a small creek, hoping a change of scenery would help me relax. As night fell, I set up camp again, trying to convince myself that last night's events were just a coincidence. But as darkness settled, the footsteps returned. This time they were unmistakable, closer, more deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight again and cautiously stepped toward the trees. Maybe it was a lost hiker, someone stumbling through the woods like me? But the moment I moved closer, the footsteps stopped, just like before. I stood there, frozen, the light from my flashlight bouncing off the trunks of the trees. Then, just at the edge of the beam, I saw something, a shadow quickly moving behind a tree. I rushed toward it, but when I arrived, there was nothing. No person, no animal, just the dark, quiet forest. I stood there for a few minutes, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what I had seen, or thought I had seen. Was my mind playing tricks on me? Exhausted, I made my way back to the campsite and crawled into the tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle, every gust of wind had me on edge. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke again. The footsteps were right outside my tent. This time they didn't stop. I could hear the distinct sound of someone, or something, slowly moving around my camp, circling the tent. My grip tightened on the flashlight. I threw the zipper open and pointed the light outside, but the moment I stepped out, everything fell silent. No movement, just the flickering shadows of the trees. By dawn I had had enough. I quickly packed up my gear and decided to get the hell out of there. The strange footprints, the eerie sounds, the sense of being watched. It was too much. I made my way back toward the parking lot, my nerves on edge the entire time. The footsteps followed me almost the whole way, faint and distant, but always there. I never turned around. I was too scared to see what might be behind me. Finally, I made it back to the parking lot, and for the first time I felt a wave of relief. I could leave this creepy place behind. But when I reached my car, my heart sank. My tires had been slashed. All 4 of them. It wasn't an animal. This was deliberate. Someone had followed me, sabotaged my car, and watched me the whole time. Panic set in. My phone had no signal, and I was miles away from help. I had no choice but to walk back to the visitor center. The trek seemed endless, the eerie footsteps never too far behind. At one point, I heard whispers, low and unintelligible, drifting through the trees. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sent chills down my spine. When I finally reached the visitor center, I burst through the doors, breathless. The staff looked at me with concern as I tried to explain what had happened. I asked if they had any cameras in the parking area, hoping to catch whoever had been messing with me. The staff informed me that there were no cameras in the lot. This was a remote area after all. There was no way to know who or what had been following me. To this day, I still don't know what was out there in the forest. I never went back, and I never will. Whatever was watching me, it didn't want me there. My wife and I had been looking forward to a peaceful vacation in the countryside for months. We rented a charming little farmhouse surrounded by vast fields and dense woods, the kind of place that offered complete isolation from the bustle of the city. It seemed perfect for us and our 5-year-old son, Oliver. He was always full of energy, and the open fields gave him plenty of space to run around and explore. On the first day, Oliver was thrilled with the freedom the place offered. He spent hours darting through the fields, laughing and chasing butterflies while my wife and I relaxed on the porch. It felt like we had finally found the escape we needed, a place where time slowed down and everything was at peace. That evening, Oliver came back inside and casually mentioned that he had made a new friend. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids have active imaginations after all. When I asked who this friend was, Oliver simply pointed out toward the tall grass in the distance, saying the boy was out there playing hide and seek with him. My wife and I exchanged a quick, amused glance. The farmhouse was so remote there was no way anyone else could be nearby. We assumed Oliver was making up stories, a common enough thing for a child his age. Later that night, as I tucked him into bed, I asked again about the friend. Oliver mentioned the boy didn't have a name but said he liked playing in the fields and wanted to meet again tomorrow. I chuckled, thinking it was just another product of his vivid imagination. Before leaving the room, I reminded him not to stray too far from the house when playing, and that was that. The next morning, Oliver rushed out to the fields the moment breakfast was over. He seemed even more excited than the day before, eager to find his new friend again. My wife and I kept an eye on him from the porch, but as the hours went by, he didn't come running back like he usually did. Normally, Oliver would dart back to show us a flower or a bug he'd found, but today there was nothing. I started to feel a little uneasy. After an hour, I called out for him. There was no response, only the gentle rustling of the wind through the tall grass. I stood up, scanning the field, but couldn't see him anywhere. When I called again, louder this time, the silence that followed made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My wife and I began to walk through the field, shouting his name, growing more frantic with each passing minute. As we ventured deeper into the tall grass, we finally spotted movement, a small figure emerging from the far side of the field. It was Oliver, smiling as if nothing had happened. My wife rushed over, her relief evident, but something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I asked him where he had been, and he calmly told us he had been with his friend, the one he had mentioned before. This time, he said, the boy had shown him something in the woods beyond the field. There was no one else around, no nearby houses, no other children, and the thought of Oliver wandering into the woods unsupervised filled me with dread. We told him to stay closer to the house from now on, and although he agreed, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me for the rest of the day. That night, after putting Oliver to bed, my wife and I talked in whispers about the situation. We weren't sure what to make of his insistence on this mysterious friend. Maybe it was just a harmless imaginary playmate, or maybe he had simply wandered off farther than we realized and invented this story to explain his absence. Either way, we planned to keep a closer eye on him. The next morning, we woke up to find Oliver already standing outside, staring off into the distance, completely still. My heart sank. When I called out to him, he didn't respond. I walked over and gently placed my hand on his shoulder. He finally turned to me, his expression blank, and in a quiet voice, he mentioned that his friend had asked him to go with him. When I pressed him for more, Oliver simply looked back at the field and said the boy was waiting. My wife and I were now beyond unsettled. Oliver had never acted like this before, and the way he spoke about this friend made it clear to us that, in his mind, the boy was very real. We decided to keep him inside for the day, but he spent most of the time quietly looking out the window as if anticipating something. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was always about the boy. The farmhouse, once peaceful and serene, now felt stifling, as if something unseen was lurking just outside. That night, after we had all gone to bed, I woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps outside. I immediately thought of Oliver. Rushing to his room, I found his bed empty, the sheets thrown back as if he had left in a hurry. Panic surged through me as I bolted out of the house and into the night. I shouted his name over and over, my voice growing hoarse as I raced toward the field, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. In the distance, near the edge of the woods, I saw him. Oliver was standing there, perfectly still, facing the forest. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted toward him, my breath ragged and frantic. When I reached him, he didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. I grabbed his arm, desperate to pull him back to safety. In a small, calm voice, he said that his friend was waiting for him just beyond the trees. I didn't care what he thought or believed at that moment. I pulled him away from the woods and back to the house, my hands trembling the entire time. My wife was waiting on the porch, her face pale and full of fear. That night, none of us slept. We locked the doors, pulled the curtains tight, and stayed awake in shifts, making sure Oliver stayed with us. At dawn, we packed up our things and left that farmhouse behind without a word. On the drive back home, we didn't speak about what had happened, but I could see the same haunted look in my wife's eyes that I felt in my own heart. Even now, months later, I still can't explain what happened out there in the field. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I wonder if that friend Oliver talked about was really just a figment of his imagination, or if there was something else, something we couldn't see but that had seen us. Oliver still occasionally mentions his friend when he plays outside, and every time he does, I feel that same cold shiver down my spine. It started about 3 weeks ago. I live alone in a small suburban house, a quiet, unremarkable place, tucked away in a neighborhood where everyone keeps to themselves. My routine was pretty ordinary. Work, come home, relax, sleep, repeat. Life wasn't exciting, but it was predictable, and I liked it that way. One night, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV when my phone rang. It was around 11 p.m., a bit late for a call, but not entirely unheard of. Without thinking much of it, I grabbed my phone off the coffee table and looked at the screen. No caller ID. I hesitated for a second but decided to pick it up. "Hello?" I said, holding the phone to my ear. Nothing. Just silence. I waited a moment, assuming it was a bad connection or some kind of prank, but there was no background noise, no static, just quiet. After a few more seconds, I hung up and shrugged it off. Probably just a wrong number, I thought. It wasn't the first time I'd received a silent call, and it didn't feel particularly unusual. The next night it happened again. Same time, same number, none. This time, though, I let it ring a few times before answering, wondering if maybe the caller would hang up first. They didn't. When I finally picked up, it was the same, complete silence on the other end. No breathing, no sounds, just that uncomfortable emptiness. I felt a slight chill but pushed it aside. It was likely a robocall glitching or some automated system malfunctioning, I told myself. After all, that sort of thing happens, right? I wasn't going to let it bother me. But then it kept happening. Every night at the exact same time, 11 p.m., the phone would ring, and when I picked up, there was nothing. By the fifth night, the feeling of unease was undeniable. I started letting it go to voicemail, but no message was ever left. Just that eerie silence, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I began to feel like I was being watched. During the day, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, wondering if someone was following me. At night, in my quiet house, every creak and groan seemed louder, sharper, as if the walls themselves were listening. I started checking the locks more often, and I even moved a chair in front of my bedroom door before going to bed. I told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something was wrong. The calls continued. No caller ID, no sound. I'd even switched my phone to silent mode, but I still found myself staring at the screen when it lit up with that familiar, nameless number. I felt like I was trapped in a strange, oppressive routine, one where I was slowly being pulled into something beyond my control. One night, after another of those silent calls, I called my phone company to see if they could trace it. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I needed answers. After a long wait, they told me they couldn't trace it. No record of the calls ever appeared on my logs. I checked again and saw it for myself. There was no trace of the number. It was as if the calls hadn't existed. That's when the dread really started to sink in. About a week later, the pattern changed. Instead of calling at 11 p.m., the phone rang earlier, around 10 p.m. I had already become hyper-aware of the time each evening, counting down the minutes to when the call would inevitably come. When it rang early that night, I felt a sharp stab of anxiety. Something was different this time. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello?" I said, my voice a little more anxious than I'd have liked. At first, there was the usual silence, but then, something changed. It wasn't much, but I thought I could hear a faint sound, breathing. Not loud, but just barely audible, as if whoever was on the other end was standing too far from the phone to be heard clearly. My heart raced as I strained to listen, trying to make sense of the noise. Was I imagining it? I stayed on the line longer than usual that night, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But eventually I gave up and hung up the phone, unsettled. I spent the rest of the night pacing the living room, every small noise making me jump. The next few nights followed the same pattern. The calls came earlier and earlier. 9:30, 9 o'clock, and each time that soft, almost imperceptible breathing was there. It became more distinct with every call, more present. I started dreading the evenings, feeling a growing sense of panic as the time crept closer to when the phone would inevitably ring. It was like waiting for something to emerge from the shadows, something I couldn't see or understand, but that was getting closer with each passing day. Then one night the call came even earlier, 8:30. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, my hand shaking as I picked up the phone. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking with fear and frustration. For the first time there was a response. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but something shifted on the other end. An intake of breath, a slight movement, as if whoever was calling had finally decided to make their presence known. The air seemed to freeze around me, and I felt my blood run cold. And then I heard it. A whisper. Faint, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. "I'm right outside." My heart stopped. I dropped the phone, the echo of the whisper reverberating in my head. My entire body went numb as I turned slowly toward the window, terrified of what I might see. The curtains were drawn, but the thought of something, or someone, standing just beyond them made my stomach churn with dread. I couldn't bring myself to look. I didn't want to know. I grabbed my keys, not even bothering to turn off the lights, and ran out of the house. I drove for hours that night, aimlessly circling the city, too scared to return home. When I finally did, everything was quiet. No missed calls, no messages. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That whoever, or whatever, had been calling me wasn't done. Since then, I've left my phone on silent, ignoring the calls that still come. But every night, as the clock ticks closer to 8:30, I can't help but glance at the window, half expecting to see something lurking just outside, waiting. I moved into this small apartment about 6 months ago. It wasn't much, but it was affordable, and the quiet suburban neighborhood seemed like the perfect place to settle after years of noisy roommates and city living. The building was old, but I didn't mind. There was a certain charm to it, and for the first few months, everything was just what I'd hoped for: peace and quiet. That all changed a few weeks ago when I started hearing footsteps in the hallway at night. At first, it didn't bother me too much. I'd hear soft footsteps outside my door late at night, around midnight. I figured it was one of my neighbors coming home late, or maybe someone taking a restless walk. But after a few nights, I noticed the footsteps always happened at the same time, midnight, without fail. What's more, they never seemed to go anywhere. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth directly outside my door. It was a little strange, but not alarming. I figured the building's thin walls and old creaky floors were probably amplifying the sound. I brushed it off, but then things started to get worse. One night, I was lying in bed waiting for sleep to come. I glanced at the clock, 11:59 p.m. I was wide awake when the footsteps started, right on time. This time I listened closely. The pacing was deliberate, slow, as though someone was walking back and forth in front of my door over and over again. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more. After a few minutes, curiosity got the better of me. I got out of bed and walked to the door, peeking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, clear as day, but no one was there. I blinked, my heart starting to pound. I stood there for a few minutes, watching and listening to the sound of the footsteps outside my door, but the hallway remained completely empty. I quickly backed away from the door, trying to shake the unsettling feeling creeping over me. The next night, the footsteps returned, again at midnight. This time, I didn't bother looking through the peephole. But something else happened. As the pacing continued outside, I heard a faint creak from inside my apartment. I froze, ears straining, as the sound of wood creaking grew louder. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. It was my dining chair, rocking ever so slightly, as if someone had just bumped into it. No windows were open. No breeze. The chair was moving on its own. I rushed over and grabbed the chair, my hands trembling. It stopped, but I couldn't shake the image of it rocking by itself. The footsteps outside my door continued, steady and rhythmic, completely indifferent to what was happening inside. I barely slept that night. Over the next few days, things escalated. The footsteps became a nightly occurrence, and strange things started happening inside my apartment. Once, while I was sitting on the couch watching TV, I saw the door to my bathroom slowly swing open. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was just a draft, even though all the windows were shut tight. Another night, I heard a distinct knock on my front door, loud and clear. I jumped up from the couch and rushed over, expecting to see someone standing there. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty, and the footsteps resumed immediately, as though whoever had knocked had simply melted into the shadows. Each night, the activity seemed to get worse. Doors would creak open, chairs would shift, and once, I could have sworn I saw a faint shadow move across the wall, just at the edge of my vision. I was terrified, but I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was stress or fatigue or just the creaky old building playing tricks on me. But then came the night when everything changed. It was past midnight and the footsteps had started as usual. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the constant pacing outside. Then, out of nowhere, the footsteps stopped, abruptly. The silence was so sudden and complete that it was almost worse than the sound. I held my breath, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. That's when I heard it, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the window beside my bed. My heart nearly stopped. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, there was no balcony, and there was absolutely no way anyone could be outside my window. I forced myself to turn my head, terrified of what I might see. The curtains were drawn, and through the fabric, I saw a faint outline, like the shadow of a hand pressed against the glass. Without thinking, I jumped out of bed and grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed for help. I wasn't going to wait around to see what was behind that curtain. The knocks grew louder, more insistent, as though whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted to be let in. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw on some clothes, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of the apartment. I drove to a friend's place and didn't look back. The next morning, I returned to gather some essentials, heart still pounding with the memories of the previous night. When I got to my apartment, everything was eerily still. The footsteps, the knocking, it had all stopped. But as I stood in the hallway, key in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, still waiting. I didn't stay long. I packed a suitcase and left that apartment for good. Whatever was pacing those halls, whatever had knocked on my window, it wasn't something I could ignore or explain away. And as much as I loved the idea of living alone, I knew I'd never feel safe in that apartment again. So I moved out. I left that quiet, charming neighborhood behind, and I've never looked back. Some nights, though, when it's quiet and still, I swear I can almost hear the faint sound of footsteps, somewhere far away just outside my door. It started on a quiet Friday night. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch, catching up on some work. It was around 11 p.m. when the doorbell rang. The sound was so sudden in the stillness of the night that it startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this late. I got up, walked to the door, and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty. Confused, I opened the door slightly, stepping out to check the front yard. There wasn't a single soul in sight. The street was still, bathed in the glow of dim streetlights. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably kids messing around, rang the doorbell as a prank, and ran off. I locked the door and went back to the couch. An hour later, just as I was getting ready to head to bed, the doorbell rang again, this time more urgently. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, listening for a moment. Maybe it was someone needing help? But at this hour? I grabbed my phone and cautiously approached the door again, this time deciding not to open it right away. I looked through the peephole once more. Still nothing. My pulse quickened. I opened the door slightly, just enough to check the porch again, but everything looked the same as before. Silent, empty, undisturbed. As I stood there, I heard a soft but unmistakable sound, footsteps. But they weren't coming from the front yard. They were coming from the side of the house. Slow, deliberate steps, moving along the gravel path near the windows. I froze. My mind raced. Was someone trying to break in? My hand tightened on the doorknob, but I didn't dare move. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped. I waited, every muscle tense, but the only thing I could hear now was the blood pounding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly backed away from the door and hurried into the living room, grabbing my phone to check the security camera feed. When I pulled up the footage, my stomach sank. The camera at the front door had caught something, a faint blur as if someone had passed quickly in front of it. Too quick for me to see through the peephole, but there. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? But what could I say? No one was there and nothing had happened, yet. I tried to calm myself down, convincing myself it was just paranoia, maybe an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Then at 1 a.m. the doorbell rang again. 3 times. Rapid, insistent. This time I jumped up immediately and went straight to the door, fueled by equal parts fear and frustration. I grabbed a flashlight, opened the door wide, and stepped outside, scanning the yard. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Fresh, muddy footprints leading from the side of the house, stopping right at my front door. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the trail with my flashlight. But what made my blood run cold was that the footprints didn't lead away. There were no exit prints, just a single set leading to my door, then stopping. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had been standing there right at my door waiting. I took a step back into the house, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Panic set in. I checked the security footage again, my hands shaking. This time, the camera feed flickered slightly, and I caught a glimpse of a dark figure standing near the corner of the house, just barely out of sight of the porch light. My heart raced. I dialed the police, telling them someone was outside my house, ringing the doorbell repeatedly and walking around. They said they'd send someone over, but it would take time given how late it was and how far out I lived. I hung up, my mind spinning. Suddenly there was a knock on the window. Not the door, the window. My head snapped toward the living room window. It was impossible to see out with the blinds drawn, but I could hear the faint tap 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 of someone knocking. Not forceful, but steady, deliberate. I took a few steps toward the window, then stopped, unsure if I should look. What if I didn't want to see who, or what, was out there? Then as I stood there, paralyzed, the knock shifted. It wasn't coming from just one window now. It was moving, first the living room, then the kitchen window. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, methodical, as if whoever was outside wanted me to follow the sound. I bolted to my bedroom, locked the door, and grabbed the only thing I could think of for protection, a heavy flashlight. I stood there in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, waiting. The knock stopped. For a few minutes, all was silent. Then, just as I was beginning to think it was over, I heard it. The soft creak of footsteps inside the house. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. No one should have been able to get in. But I heard the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I backed up against the wall, my hands trembling as I clutched the flashlight, waiting for the inevitable. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. Before I could react, there was a single loud knock on the door. Police, open up. I let out a shaky breath, fumbled to unlock the door, and opened it. 2 officers stood there looking at me with concern. They searched the entire house but found no one. No signs of forced entry. No evidence that anyone had been inside. They checked the perimeter, but aside from the footprints leading to the door, there was nothing. They told me it was likely just someone messing around, maybe trying to scare me, but they couldn't explain the knocks or the footsteps. The next morning, I packed my things and left the house. I don't know what was out there that night or how it got so close without being seen. But I couldn't stay. Not after what I heard, what I felt. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that tap 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 in my mind, wondering if whoever, or whatever, was out there is still looking for me. It was late when I decided to stop by the 24-hour supermarket on my way home from work. It wasn't my usual habit, but I needed a few things and I liked the idea of avoiding the crowds. The store was mostly empty, save for a few night shift workers stocking shelves, and a handful of other customers quietly going about their business. I grabbed a basket and started down the aisles. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, and the store's speakers played low, barely audible music. I was making my way through the canned goods section when I noticed someone at the end of the aisle, a man standing completely still, his hood pulled low over his face, staring directly at me. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to look away. Maybe he was just browsing, lost in thought. Still, there was something unsettling about the way he stood there, not moving, just watching. I quickly grabbed what I needed and moved to the next aisle. But as I turned the corner into the cereal section, he was there again. this time closer. He didn't move or reach for anything on the shelves. His hood obscured most of his face, but I could feel his gaze. My skin crawled and I felt a sudden rush of cold. I glanced at him briefly, then quickly turned away, hurrying toward the frozen food section. As I reached the freezers, I turned my head slightly, my heart racing. He was following me. This time he was only a few steps behind, walking slowly, his feet barely making a sound. I could feel his presence looming behind me, his steps eerily in sync with mine. Panic welled up in my chest. I grabbed a random frozen item and headed for the checkout, my breath quickening. When I reached the register, I finally let out a shaky breath. The cashier, oblivious to my panic, greeted me as usual, but I could barely respond. I glanced over my shoulder. He was standing at the end of the aisle, still watching. My hands trembled as I paid for my items, my eyes constantly flicking back to where the man stood. I left the store as quickly as I could, clutching my grocery bag tightly. The automatic door slid open and the cool night air hit my face. Relief started to wash over me, but it didn't last long. As I reached my car in the nearly empty parking lot, I fumbled with my keys, trying to get them out of my pocket. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned around, my pulse racing. The man was there, standing about 20 feet away, his face still hidden under his hood, his figure barely illuminated by the dim parking lot lights. He didn't move. He just stood there watching me. I quickly unlocked my car, my hands shaking, and threw my groceries into the back seat. As I scrambled into the driver's seat, I saw him take a step forward, then another, moving deliberately toward my car. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed the door shut and locked it. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He was closer now, standing just a few feet from my bumper. His head was tilted slightly, as if he was trying to get a better look at me. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. I reversed out of the parking spot as fast as I could, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. As I pulled away, the man just stood there, watching, his figure shrinking in the distance as I sped out of the lot. I didn't dare look back until I was halfway home. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, somehow. When I got home, I checked the locks on every door and window, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it was just a random encounter, that he hadn't followed me home. But I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with every creak and groan of the house. The next morning, I stepped out to grab the mail, still feeling on edge. As I approached the front steps, I froze. There, on the dew-soaked ground, were fresh footprints. They led from the street directly to my front door, deep, muddy imprints that hadn't been there the night before. My stomach churned with fear. Someone had been at my house. He had been at my house. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me, heart pounding. I checked my phone's security app, hoping to catch something on camera, but there was nothing. The footage showed only the empty street and my front porch, as if no one had ever been there. The footprints outside told a different story. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? What would I say? I had no evidence of who it was, only those footprints leading to my door. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd be back. Every shadow in my house felt ominous, every sound magnified in my mind. I spent the rest of the day glued to the windows, waiting for him to return. That night, as darkness fell, I found myself unable to relax. The memory of those footprints haunted me, and I kept replaying the events of the supermarket and parking lot in my mind. Around midnight, I thought I heard something, a faint sound like footsteps on gravel. My blood ran cold. I walked cautiously to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. At first, I saw nothing. The street was quiet, the soft hum of distant traffic the only noise. But then, just at the edge of the streetlight's reach, I saw a figure. It was him. The man from the supermarket, standing at the edge of my property, watching my house. My hands shook as I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't risk another encounter. Without another thought, I grabbed my car keys and hurried out the back door, slipping into my car and speeding away, my breath shallow and panicked. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I couldn't stay there, knowing he was out there, watching, waiting for his next move. I wasn't planning on being out so late. The road back home stretched endlessly in front of me, a dark ribbon through the countryside, with only the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse light breaking the monotony. It was the middle of nowhere and I was hours from home. I knew better than to take these isolated routes at night, but I was tired of the highway and this back road seemed quicker. The rain started suddenly, a heavy downpour that turned the road slick. My wipers barely kept up with the torrents as the headlights cut through the sheets of water. That's when I saw him, a lone figure drenched, standing on the side of the road, his thumb sticking out. I had a bad feeling immediately, but it was pouring and the nearest town was still miles away. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled the window down just slightly, enough to speak through the crack. "Need a ride?" I asked, squinting at the rain. He leaned down to the window, his face shadowed by a soaking hood. "Yeah, thanks," he said, his voice low and hoarse. His hands were trembling and he looked absolutely miserable. For a second I thought about just driving off, but something stopped me. I unlocked the door and let him in. The interior light flickered on briefly as he climbed in, soaking the seat with his wet clothes. I quickly turned the light off, preferring the comfort of the dim cabin over the harsh glow. I glanced over at him. He didn't say much, just nodded and mumbled something that could have been thanks, and I pulled back onto the road. For the first 10 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic slap of the wipers and the low hum of the engine. I tried making small talk, asking where he was headed, but his answers were vague. He never mentioned a specific destination, just down the road or as far as you're going. I felt my unease grow with each non-answer. As the rain beat down harder, I noticed him fidgeting in the passenger seat. His hands were constantly moving, tapping his leg, adjusting his hood, scratching his arm. It wasn't just nervousness, it was like he couldn't sit still. And then I noticed something else. His hands weren't just trembling. They were shaking violently, enough that I thought he might be having some sort of fit. "Are you all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward me, his hood still casting a shadow over his face. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice had changed. It wasn't hoarse anymore, it was sharp, almost aggressive. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my palms starting to sweat despite the cold air blasting from the vents. My instincts screamed at me to stop the car and tell him to get out, but we were miles from anywhere and the storm was relentless. There was no turning back now. Suddenly, without warning, he lunged at the dashboard, grabbing the radio dials and twisting them furiously. Static erupted from the speakers, a jarring burst of noise that filled the car. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, trying to keep control of the wheel as I reached to push his hands away. His eyes, wide and wild, turned toward me. "It's too quiet," he muttered, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "It's always too quiet." He yanked the dials again, making the static screech louder. I grabbed his wrist, pulling his hand off the radio, and for a second we were both wrestling over the dashboard, the car swerving slightly on the wet road. "Stop," I shouted, trying to regain control. For a moment he sat back, breathing heavily, his hands twitching in his lap. I kept one eye on the road and one eye on him, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could feel my heart hammering against my chest, my mind racing with thoughts of how to get out of this situation. But then he laughed. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was low and raspy, more of a snicker that sent chills down my spine. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he said softly, still staring straight ahead. That was it. I wasn't going to wait to see where this went. I was done. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. The hitchhiker turned slowly to face me, his eyes narrowing. He didn't move for a second, just sat there as if he was deciding what to do next. Then, in one swift movement, he reached into his jacket. My blood froze. I thought he was pulling out a weapon, and my mind screamed at me to act before he did. I fumbled with the seatbelt, ready to leap out of the car. But instead he pulled out a photograph. He tossed it onto my lap. "You need to remember," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Confused, I glanced down at the photo. It was a picture of me, sitting in my car. The same car we were in right now, taken from the back seat. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold wave of terror washed over me. I looked back at him, but he was already gone. The passenger door was wide open, the rain pouring in, but there was no sign of him. Just the distant echo of his footsteps disappearing into the storm. I sat there, trembling, staring at the photo. How had he taken it? Why was he watching me? I slammed the door shut, threw the car into gear, and sped off, the photograph still lying on the passenger seat. I didn't stop driving until I reached home, and when I did, I bolted inside, locking every door and window behind me. But I knew it wasn't over. That picture, those eyes watching me from the back seat, I could still feel them even now, as if he was out there waiting for the right moment to return. It seemed like an easy way to make some extra cash, renting out my spare room through Airbnb. I had done it a few times before without any issues, and the reviews had been great. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and most guests were just passing through, staying for a night or two on their way to somewhere else. Nothing out of the ordinary. That all changed last weekend. The booking came in late Friday night, last minute, but not unusual. The guest's name was Michael, and according to his profile, he was just passing through town on his way to a job interview. His picture showed a clean-cut, normal-looking guy in his early 30s. Nothing about him raised any red flags, so I accepted the booking. He arrived a little after 9 p.m., exactly when he said he would. The moment I opened the door, though, I felt a pang of unease. He stood there, a tall man with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, but his face was different from the photo. He looked worn, almost gaunt, and his eyes were sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said, his voice low and flat. He didn't smile. I brushed off my discomfort and showed him to his room. He barely said anything during the tour, just nodded occasionally. Once he was settled, I retreated to my own space, figuring he was probably just tired from a long trip. I didn't think much of it. After all, it was just one night. Around midnight, I was lying in bed, almost drifting off to sleep, when I heard it, the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I figured it was Michael, maybe going to the bathroom, so I ignored it at first. But then the footsteps didn't stop. They were slow, deliberate, as if he was pacing back and forth in front of my door. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. The footsteps continued, rhythmic, back and forth. My pulse quickened. Why would he be pacing like that at this hour? I listened, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for him to stop. But he didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally faded. I told myself it was nothing, maybe he was just restless. I tried to shake off the unease and get back to sleep. But then, at around 2 a.m., I heard something else. A quiet, soft knock on my bedroom door. It was so faint at first that I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate taps. My stomach dropped. Why would he be knocking on my door at this hour? I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities. Was he in trouble? Did he need something? But something in my gut told me to stay still, not to respond. I lay there, frozen, barely breathing, waiting for him to knock again. But instead of knocking, I heard the door handle slowly turn, the soft click of metal as he tested whether the door was locked. Thank God it was. I didn't move. I didn't dare make a sound. I just listened as he stood outside my door for what felt like an eternity, his hand still on the handle, not moving, not speaking. Just standing there. Finally, after what must have been several minutes, I heard him retreat down the hallway. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 2:30 a.m. I debated calling the police, but what would I say? He hadn't done anything illegal yet. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for any sign of movement, any hint that he might try to come back. But everything remained eerily quiet until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I got out of bed, my body tense with anxiety. I wasn't going to wait for him to leave. I wanted him out. No. I knocked on his door, my voice as steady as I could manage. "Hey Michael, checkout is soon. Just wanted to remind you." There was no response. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. A sick feeling crept into my stomach. I turned the handle and opened the door just a crack, peeking inside. The room was empty. His duffel bag was gone, the bed neatly made as if no one had slept there. There was no sign that he had ever been in the house. My heart raced as I stepped inside, scanning the room. How had he left without me hearing? I'd been up all night, listening, and I hadn't heard the front door open or close once. Then I noticed something on the bedside table. A small, folded piece of paper. I picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it. Inside, written in neat, almost delicate handwriting, were 4 words that made my blood run cold. "I'll be back soon." I dropped the note, backing out of the room as my mind raced. Who was this guy? Why had he been pacing outside my door in the middle of the night? And most importantly, how had he left without making a sound? I didn't wait to find out. I packed a bag and left the house within the hour. I stayed with a friend for a few days, too scared to go back. When I finally did return, everything seemed normal, but the house didn't feel the same. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm trying to fall asleep, I think I hear footsteps outside my door again. Slow, deliberate, like someone is pacing back and forth, waiting. It was late, and I had been driving for hours, trying to get back home after a long work trip. The highway stretched out endlessly, and fatigue had started to hit me hard. I needed gas anyway, so when I saw a flickering neon sign for a 24-hour gas station just off the highway, I pulled over. The place was isolated, just a small, rundown gas station with a single pump and an empty convenience store. The lights in the lot flickered intermittently, casting odd shadows across the pavement. I was the only one there. I parked at the pump and stepped out into the chilly night air. As I started fueling up, I noticed something, movement from the corner of my eye. A man stood by the convenience store entrance, leaning against the wall. I hadn't seen him when I pulled in, and he hadn't been standing there when I got out of the car. It was like he'd appeared out of nowhere. He was tall, dressed in an old, dirty jacket, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face, obscuring his features. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching me. My pulse quickened, but I tried to keep calm, telling myself it was just some guy hanging around. But something about him felt wrong. His stillness, the way he seemed to be staring directly at me without moving an inch. My instincts screamed at me to finish pumping gas and get the hell out of there. As I put the pump back, I stole another glance in his direction. He was still there, but this time, his head was tilted ever so slightly, as if he was listening for something. My heart raced, and I fumbled with my keys, desperate to get back into the car. Just as I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he started walking toward me, his steps echoing across the empty lot. There was something unnatural about his movements, too slow, too deliberate, like he wasn't in a hurry, but he knew I wasn't going anywhere. I turned the key, my hands shaking, the engine sputtering to life. I glanced at the man again. He was closer now, maybe only 20 feet away, his head still tilted, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his cap. I could feel his eyes on me even though I couldn't see them. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the pump, my tires screeching on the pavement. As I sped out of the lot, I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him standing there watching me drive away. But he was gone. I blinked, my heart racing, but the lot was empty. The man had disappeared. I drove for a few minutes, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep in my gut. My eyes flicked between the road and the rearview mirror, half expecting him to be sitting in the back seat. The highway was dark and empty, the faint glow of my headlights the only thing piercing the darkness ahead. Then I saw it, a pair of headlights in the distance, growing larger in my rearview mirror. At first I was relieved, another car, finally. But as the vehicle drew closer, a cold knot of fear twisted in my stomach. The car wasn't just following me, it was speeding up, closing the distance between us at an alarming rate. My hands tightened on the wheel as the car's headlights filled my rearview mirror. It was so close now that I could barely see anything but the blinding light. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing. Who was this? Could it be the man from the gas station? I pushed down on the accelerator, my car picking up speed, but the other car stayed right on my tail. I switched lanes, hoping it would pass me by, but it swerved behind me, staying close, too close. My heart raced as I realized this wasn't a coincidence. Someone was chasing me. I sped up, going well over the speed limit, trying to put distance between us. But the car stayed with me, its engine roaring, headlights burning into my rearview mirror. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it the man from the gas station? Was he trying to run me off the road? Then, without warning, the car swerved violently, pulling up alongside me. For a split second, I glanced over, and that's when I saw him. The same man from the gas station, his face partially illuminated by the glow of his headlights, staring at me with an expressionless face. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that sent a wave of terror through me. His car swerved closer, almost clipping the side of mine. I jerked the wheel, narrowly avoiding him, but the road ahead was a narrow two-lane highway, no shoulder to pull over on, no exits in sight. I was trapped. The man kept pace with me, his car swerving back and forth, forcing me closer to the edge of the road. My pulse was pounding in my ears, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to stay on the road. Panic clawed at me, but I couldn't lose control. I couldn't let him force me off the road. Just as I was about to floor the gas, desperate to outrun him, his car swerved sharply again, this time pulling directly in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding as the tires squealed, coming to a halt just inches from the back of his vehicle. I sat there, breathing heavily, my hands shaking. The man's car was completely still in front of me, blocking the road. His brake lights flickered in the darkness. I waited, my heart pounding, watching for any sign of movement. Then his car door slowly opened. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The man stepped out, his form silhouetted in the glow of his brake lights, and started walking toward me. I slammed the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed away from him, heart racing out of control. Without thinking, I threw the car into drive and swerved around his vehicle, barely missing it as I sped down the highway. I didn't look back. I didn't care what happened to him or his car. I just drove, my hands trembling on the wheel, my heart pounding, until I reached the safety of the next town. Even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to stop at the next gas station. I didn't think much of it when my friend Sarah asked me to house sit for her while she went out of town for a few days. She lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and I figured it would be an easy job. All I had to do was water the plants, collect the mail, and make sure everything was locked up at night. It sounded simple enough. The first night was uneventful. I cooked dinner, watched TV, and enjoyed having a nice place to myself for a change. The house was cozy, and Sarah had made sure to leave me everything I needed. By the time I went to bed, I was relaxed and ready to enjoy the quiet weekend ahead. But then things took a turn. It was around midnight when I woke up to the sound of a dog barking. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe one of the neighbors had let their dog out. But the barking was coming from Sarah's backyard. Confused, I got out of bed and went to the window. Sarah didn't have a dog. I pulled the curtain back slightly, peering out into the dark yard. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty lawn and the shadows cast by the trees swaying in the wind. But then, at the far edge of the yard, near the fence, I saw movement. A man. He was standing just inside the fence line, partially hidden in the shadows, facing the house. My heart skipped a beat. Why would someone be in Sarah's backyard in the middle of the night? For a moment, I considered calling the police, but then I thought maybe it was just a neighbor or someone who had wandered in by accident. I didn't want to overreact, so I stayed quiet, watching to see what he would do next. He didn't move. He just stood there staring toward the house. I backed away from the window, my pulse quickening. Something was wrong. This wasn't just someone passing by. This person was intentionally standing there, watching. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he would leave on his own. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step forward. I quickly pulled the curtain shut and backed away from the window, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and texted Sarah, asking if she knew who might be in her yard, but there was no response. I paced around the living room trying to decide what to do next. Then the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the empty house, freezing me in place. There was no way that guy could have gotten to the front door so quickly. My stomach churned with fear as I cautiously approached the door, my hands shaking. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see the man from the backyard, but no one was there. I stood there, staring through the peephole, half expecting him to jump out from the shadows. But the porch was empty, just like the street outside. I double-checked the locks on the door and backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. A loud bang echoed through the house, coming from the backyard. I rushed back to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. My breath caught in my throat. The man was now much closer, standing just a few feet from the back door, staring up at the window I was looking through. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing with panic. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and let this happen. I grabbed my phone again, ready to call the police, but before I could dial, the back door handle rattled. He was trying to get inside. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. I ran to the kitchen looking for something, anything I could use as a weapon. The handle rattled again, harder this time. I grabbed a knife from the counter, my hands trembling. What was I supposed to do? Confront him? I'd run. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, everything went completely still. My breathing was ragged as I stood there, clutching the knife, waiting. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving along the side of the house. I ran to the front window, pulling the curtain back just in time to see him walking down the driveway toward the street. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I quickly realized he wasn't leaving. He was circling the house. I moved from window to window, tracking his movements as he walked around the perimeter, his slow pace and unhurried demeanor filling me with dread. He wasn't in any rush. He knew I was trapped inside. As I watched him, the doorbell rang again. I froze. He was back at the front door. This time, I didn't bother checking the peephole. I ran upstairs to Sarah's bedroom, locked the door, and huddled in the corner with my phone. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a moment to dial 911. "Someone's outside," I whispered when the operator answered. "He's trying to get into the house." The operator asked me a series of questions. Was I safe? Were the doors locked? Could I see him now? I answered as best I could, but my mind was clouded with fear. I told her about the man in the backyard, the ringing doorbell, the footsteps circling the house. She assured me that the police were on their way, but it felt like hours before they arrived. When I finally heard the sound of sirens approaching, I felt a surge of relief. I went to the window, hoping to see the man running, fleeing from the sound of approaching police cars. But when I looked outside, he was gone. Vanished. The police searched the property, combing through the backyard, checking the doors and windows for signs of forced entry. But there was nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. It was as if the man had never existed at all. I tried to explain what had happened, but they seemed skeptical. They said it could have been a prank or maybe a case of mistaken identity, someone looking for the wrong house. But I knew what I saw. I knew he had been there watching me, waiting to get inside. I didn't stay another night at Sarah's. I packed my things and left as soon as the police were done, my hands still trembling from the fear. A few days later, Sarah returned from her trip. I hesitated to tell her the full story, not wanting to scare her, but I couldn't shake the lingering dread. When I finally did tell her what happened, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me with a strange expression. "You're not the first person to say something like that," she said softly. "The last few people who've stayed here, they said they saw someone too." It started as a typical weeknight. I had just settled in on the couch after a long day, my phone sitting on the coffee table, lighting up occasionally with the usual social media notifications. It was one of those quiet, uneventful evenings, the kind where you don't expect anything strange to happen. Then around 9 p.m. I got the first text. It was from an unknown number. "Hey, it's me. You there?" I stared at the screen for a moment, confused. I didn't recognize the number, but it could have been someone I knew with a new phone. I decided to ignore it, figuring it was a wrong number or a scam. But just as I started to relax again, another text came in. "Why aren't you answering? You never ignore me." A chill crept up my spine. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. It felt personal, almost accusatory, as if the person knew me well. But I still had no idea who they were. I typed back a quick response. "I think you have the wrong number." Almost immediately, another text came through. "Don't joke with me. You know exactly who this is." I felt uneasy, the atmosphere in the room suddenly thick with tension. The TV, which had been background noise, seemed distant now. My focus was completely on the phone in my hand, on the messages from this stranger who seemed convinced they knew me. I replied again, more firmly this time. "Seriously, I don't know who you are." This time the reply took longer. When it finally came, it wasn't a text. It was a photo. I hesitated before opening it, my stomach tightening with anxiety. When I finally swiped it open, my heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of my front door, taken from outside. The time stamp in the corner showed it had been taken only a few minutes ago. I jumped off the couch and rushed to the window, peering out into the night. The porch light illuminated the small front yard, but there was no one there. My hands started shaking as I checked the door, locked thankfully. But the idea that someone had been standing outside, taking pictures without me noticing, made my skin crawl. My phone buzzed again. "I'm here. Why won't you come out?" I backed away from the door, my breath catching in my throat. Who was this? How had they found me? I hadn't told anyone I was home alone tonight, hadn't posted anything online. Another buzz. "You're scaring me. Why won't you talk to me? We're so close." I couldn't take it anymore. I dialed the police, my voice shaking as I explained that someone was texting me, that they had sent a photo of my house and claimed to be outside. The dispatcher assured me that officers would be on their way, but it would take at least 10 minutes for them to arrive. 10 minutes. It felt like an eternity. I backed into the living room, glancing nervously at the windows. Every shadow outside seemed to shift, every small noise heightened by my fear. My phone buzzed again and I nearly dropped it. "I can see you." My blood ran cold. I froze, too scared to move, scanning the room for any sign of where they might be watching from. The curtains were drawn and the blinds were closed. They couldn't see inside, right? I typed a quick reply, my fingers trembling. "Where are you?" The response came immediately. "Closer than you think." I felt like I was going to be sick. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this someone who knew me? A friend playing a sick joke? A stalker who had somehow found out where I lived? The next text arrived before I could think of another response. "Look outside." I hesitated, my entire body tense with fear. Slowly, I crept toward the window, moving the curtain aside just a crack to peek outside. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the empty street, the dim glow of street lights. But then I saw movement. Someone standing at the edge of my yard, partially obscured by the shadow of a tree. My heart raced as I realized the figure was staring directly at the house, unmoving. They weren't close, but they were watching, waiting. Before I could react, my phone buzzed again. "Come outside. I just want to see you." I backed away from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer. They were just waiting. I dialed the police again, barely able to speak through my panic. "They're here. I can see them. They're standing in my yard." The dispatcher told me to stay inside, that officers were almost there. Another text came through. "Why are you scared?" "It's just me." Who was this person? How long had they been watching me? I couldn't stop the flood of terrifying thoughts rushing through my mind. Then, without warning, the figure started moving. They stepped out from behind the tree, walking slowly toward the house. My breath caught in my throat. They were getting closer, and I had nowhere to go. I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but the figure was already at the edge of my porch. My phone buzzed again, the message coming through just as the police arrived. "I'll see you soon." The officers rushed onto the porch, but by the time they got there, the figure had vanished. They searched the yard, the street, but found no one. No footprints, no trace of the person who had been watching me. As I sat in the living room trying to calm my nerves, one of the officers handed me my phone, still buzzing with notifications. "I think you should see this," he said. My phone had received another message. This time it was another picture. It was a photo of me sitting on the couch, looking terrified, taken from inside the house. It was a Friday night, and I had stayed late at the office to finish up some last-minute work. The building was mostly empty by 7 p.m., with just a few late-working colleagues still hanging around. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, it was just me left. The office felt different at night. The usual hum of conversation and the sounds of ringing phones had been replaced by silence, interrupted only by the occasional hum of the HVAC system or the flickering of fluorescent lights. Normally, I didn't mind staying late, but tonight something about the emptiness felt wrong. I shrugged it off and got back to work, determined to finish up and get out of there. My desk was in the far corner of the open-plan office, which gave me a clear view of the entire floor. I liked it during the day, but at night it made me feel exposed, like I could see everything, and anything could see me. Around 10:30, I heard the faint sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe one of the cleaning staff had come in early. I listened closely, but the footsteps didn't sound like the usual shuffle of someone vacuuming or dusting. They were slow and deliberate, moving in a steady rhythm across the floor. I sat up in my chair, scanning the open space in front of me. Nothing. Just the rows of empty desks and dimmed computer screens. I shook my head, trying to focus on my work again, but the sound continued, getting closer. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I could hear a faint tapping, like someone was dragging something lightly across the desks as they walked. I stood up, my heart pounding. I called out, asking if anyone was there, my voice echoing in the empty office. No response. I walked over to the main hallway, hoping to spot whoever was making the noise. The lights in the hallway flickered slightly as I stepped out of the open office area, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could feel my skin prickling with unease. There shouldn't have been anyone else here at this hour. I continued down the hall, my footsteps echoing loudly now, the only sound breaking the silence. When I reached the end of the hall, I paused, looking down toward the darkened break room. The sound of footsteps had stopped, and I wondered if maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Stress could do that, I told myself. But as I turned back toward the office, something caught my eye. There, at the far end of the hallway, just visible in the dim light, was a figure standing near the elevators. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, his back to me, standing perfectly still. He didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't seem to notice I was there. He was just waiting. I froze, unsure of what to do. My first thought was that it must be one of the cleaning staff or a late working colleague. But something about the way he was standing made my skin crawl. He was too still, too quiet. I called out again, trying to sound casual, asking if he needed anything. The man didn't move. He didn't even turn to acknowledge me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to leave, I should have left. but something compelled me to walk closer to figure out who this man was and why he was just standing there. My footsteps echoed in the hall as I approached, and with each step, my stomach twisted tighter. When I was only a few feet away, I spoke more firmly, asking if he was all right or if something was wrong. Suddenly, the man turned, his head snapping toward me so fast it made me flinch. His face was partially hidden by the shadow of his hood, but I could see enough. His eyes, cold and unblinking, locked onto mine. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no fear. It was like he had been waiting for me to approach. Before I could react, he moved, quickly. He lunged forward, closing the gap between us in an instant. His hand shot out, grabbing me by the front of my shirt and slammed me against the wall. Pain shot through my back as I struggled to push him off, but he was strong, much stronger than I had anticipated. I kicked at him, trying to break free, but he shoved me harder against the wall, pinning me there. His grip tightened, and I could feel the air being forced out of my lungs. I gasped for breath, asking who he was, trying to understand why this was happening, but the words barely escaped my lips. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, and for a split second, I thought he was pulling out a weapon. Panic surged through me, and I kicked out again, this time catching him in the leg. He grunted and stumbled backward, loosening his grip just enough for me to push him off. I didn't wait. I bolted down the hallway, my legs shaking as I sprinted back toward the office. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps pounding against the floor as he chased me. My mind raced. I needed to find a way out, fast. I reached my desk and grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy glass paperweight. I spun around just as he came at me, swinging the paperweight as hard as I could. It caught him on the shoulder, knocking him off balance. But it wasn't enough. He barely flinched before coming at me again, more furious this time. I backed away, frantically searching for something else to defend myself with. My eyes landed on my phone lying on the desk. I grabbed it, hitting the emergency call button just as he lunged for me again. I ducked under his arm and darted toward the emergency stairs, the phone still ringing in my hand. I burst through the stairwell door and started running down the stairs, skipping 2 steps at a time. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could hear him close behind me, his footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. Just as I reached the bottom floor, I heard the emergency operator on the other end of the line asking for my location. I barely had the breath to explain, telling them there was a man attacking me, that I was in the Hudson Plaza office building, and he was still chasing me. I burst out of the stairwell and into the lobby, my eyes scanning for any sign of help. But the building was deserted. The operator urged me to stay calm and told me that help was on the way. I could barely think straight, the fear clouding my mind. I ran toward the front doors, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him behind me, getting closer. I shoved the door open and ran outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I sprinted across the parking lot, my legs burning with exhaustion. Behind me, the man stopped at the edge of the building, his hood still casting shadows over his face. He watched me for a moment, then turned and disappeared back into the building. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. I told them everything, how he had attacked me, how he had chased me through the building. The officers searched the premises, and this time they found something. The surveillance footage showed the man entering the building earlier that evening. He wasn't a co-worker or a security guard, he was a thief. The footage showed him rummaging through drawers in a nearby office, taking electronics and small valuables. But then, in one of the clips, he stopped. He looked up, directly into the camera, and then turned down the hall, toward me. I haven't stayed late at the office since. It was supposed to be a simple drive. I was traveling from Philadelphia to my friend's place in upstate New York. It was already past midnight, and I was about an hour from the nearest town when I noticed my fuel gauge dipping alarmingly close to empty. I cursed under my breath. The highway was deserted, no sign of another car for miles. My GPS showed the nearest gas station was about 10 miles ahead. When I finally saw the faint glow of the station's lights, I exhaled in relief. It was one of those small, isolated gas stations you only see in rural parts of the country. Old, with a single pump and a small store attached. The lights flickered slightly, casting an eerie glow across the lot. I pulled in and parked by the pump. As I stepped out, a strange silence settled over the place, one that made my skin prickle. There were no crickets, no wind rustling through the nearby trees, just an unnatural stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. I shrugged it off, reasoning that it was just the time of night playing tricks on me. I approached the pump, swiping my card and selecting the fuel grade. Nothing happened. The pump screen flickered, then displayed a message, "Please pay inside." I sighed, grabbed my wallet from the car, and walked toward the small convenience store. The windows were so dusty I could barely see inside, but a faint light suggested it was open. As I entered, a small bell chimed. The store was empty, its fluorescent lights buzzing quietly above. Rows of snacks and drinks were covered in a thin layer of dust, and the air smelled faintly of something stale, something metallic. I walked up to the counter, expecting to see a clerk or at least a service bell. Instead, there was a small note taped to the register that read, "Back in 5 minutes." I tapped my fingers on the counter, debating whether I should just wait. It was quiet, but something felt wrong. I glanced around, noticing a few odd details. The clock behind the counter was frozen at 3:15, and a stack of newspapers by the door showed yesterday's date. Then there was the noise, a faint humming that seemed to be coming from the back room. I strained my ears, but just as I was about to go check, the humming stopped, leaving the store in heavy silence once more. I was about to turn back to my car, deciding I'd find a different gas station, when I noticed something in the security monitor hanging in the corner of the room. The small, grainy screen showed an overhead view of the parking lot. At first, it looked normal, just my car, the pump, and the empty lot. But then, my eyes caught a faint shadowy figure near the edge of the frame, standing close to the trees. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like someone was just standing there, almost blending in with the darkness. A chill ran down my spine. I blinked, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I shook my head, telling myself I was just exhausted. Turning back to the pump, I slid my card in again and heard the familiar click as the machine finally started up. As the gas flowed into my tank, I found myself glancing nervously toward the trees, expecting the figure to reappear. The tank filled up, and I quickly replaced the nozzle, ready to get out of there. But as I climbed into my car, I saw something in my rearview mirror that made my stomach drop. Someone was standing at the edge of the lot just behind my car. The same shadowy figure from the security footage, only now I could see them a little more clearly. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing. His face was obscured, but his head was tilted slightly as if he was watching me. I froze, gripping the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at me to just drive, but something held me back. My hand moved to the door lock, and as if on cue, he took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, almost taunting as he moved closer to my car. I reached for my phone to call 911, but there was no signal. Frustrated, I threw my phone onto the passenger seat. I glanced back up at the rearview mirror, only to realize he was no longer behind the car. My heart pounded. I twisted in my seat, scanning the lot, the pump, the trees. There was no sign of him. And then, a tap. A single, light tap on the driver's side window. I snapped my head to the left, and there he was, crouched beside my window, face inches away from the glass. His eyes were wide and staring, unblinking, with a twisted grin that stretched far too wide across his face. His hand was pressed flat against the window, fingers splayed, his nails unnaturally long and dark. Panic surged through me, and I slammed my foot onto the gas. The car jolted forward, screeching as it sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I could see him standing in the middle of the road, still staring after me, that awful grin fixed on his face, his figure slowly fading into the darkness as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to pull over once I saw the lights of a diner up ahead. I stumbled inside, out of breath, and collapsed into a booth. The waitress noticed my pale face and trembling hands and asked if I was all right. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. All I managed was, "The gas station, there was someone there." She looked at me with a strange expression, then glanced around the diner as if she was worried about being overheard. Leaning in closer, she whispered, "You're not the first one to see him. That gas station has been abandoned for years." My blood ran cold. I tried to argue, but I remembered the dust, the broken clock, the old newspapers. It didn't make sense, but nothing about that night did. All I know is that I'll never drive that route alone again, not after midnight, not after what I saw. I just moved into my new apartment, a small one-bedroom in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a step up from my last place in the city, with less noise and cleaner air. My neighbor, Mr. Hensley, was an older man, polite but reserved. I'd only spoken to him briefly when I'd first moved in. He'd nodded, muttered a soft welcome, and shuffled back inside. He had one of those faces that seemed carved from stone, sharp features, hollow eyes. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, everyone has their own quirks. The first time I noticed something odd was about a week after moving in. It was late, maybe close to midnight, when I heard faint noises coming from Mr. Hensley's apartment. I was lying in bed, struggling to fall asleep, and at first I thought it was just the pipes or an old radiator acting up. But the sounds grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just noise, it was like a low murmur, almost like chanting. I got up and went to the wall that separated our apartments, pressing my ear against it. The chanting grew clearer, and I could pick up strange words, almost like another language. Just as I leaned in closer, everything fell silent. The suddenness of it made me jump. I stood there, frozen, but heard nothing more that night. The following morning, I tried to shake it off. It was probably just a dream, I told myself. But every night after that, the chanting would return, always around the same time. The first few nights, I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to Mr. Hensley being a little eccentric. But the more I heard it, the harder it was to ignore. The words sounded darker, more urgent each night. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I went to my front door and opened it as quietly as possible, stepping out into the hallway. His door was shut, of course, but from underneath it, a faint glow seeped into the hallway, a reddish light that pulsed, almost like it was breathing. My heart pounded as I approached his door. I knew it was a terrible idea, but some force pulled me forward. I couldn't look away from that light. As I got closer, I noticed a strange smell, a thick, metallic scent that clung to the air and made my stomach turn. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't stop myself. Then the chanting stopped abruptly. I froze, holding my breath, listening for any sign that Mr. Hensley knew I was there. And then, as if he could sense me, his door creaked open just a crack. I jumped back, my heart in my throat. Through the small gap, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Hensley's face, but he didn't seem to see me. He looked distant, his eyes glazed over and fixed on something far away. He mumbled to himself, his words just as strange and unsettling as his chanting. My feet were glued to the floor, unable to move as he slowly closed the door again without a word. I barely slept that night. Images of his face, the strange light, and the chanting haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I decided that I would try to confront him the next day, just casually ask if everything was all right, as if I hadn't been sneaking around outside his door. The next morning, I waited until I heard him moving around in his apartment. I knocked, my heart racing as I waited. It took him a long time to answer, and when he did, he looked worse than before. Dark circles hung under his eyes, his skin pallid and almost waxy. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Mr. Hensley, I've been hearing some noises," I began awkwardly. "Are you okay?" He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes blank as if he didn't recognize me. Then he blinked, his expression clearing slightly. I apologize," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I can't help it." I didn't know what to say to that. He closed the door, leaving me standing in the hallway, even more unsettled than before. I decided that it was none of my business and tried to leave it alone. But that night, the chanting started up again, louder than ever. And this time, it was accompanied by a scraping noise, like furniture being dragged across the floor. My curiosity turned to dread. I decided I'd had enough. I needed to know what was going on in that apartment. I waited until I was sure he'd left. It was late afternoon, and I'd seen him walk down the hall toward the exit. My heart pounded as I approached his door, trying the knob. To my surprise, it turned easily in my hand. The door was unlocked. I slipped inside, the metallic smell hitting me immediately. The apartment was dark, all the curtains drawn, with the faintest trace of that reddish glow coming from down the hallway. I followed it, my footsteps silent on the carpet, until I reached a small room at the end of the hall. Inside, the room was nearly empty except for a strange symbol painted on the floor, some kind of intricate circle with unfamiliar markings. In the center lay a single black candle, its flame still flickering despite the lack of anyone else around. The walls were covered with photos, hundreds of them, and they were all of me. Pictures from when I first moved in, sitting on my balcony, walking down the hallway. Some were taken at night, through my window. My stomach churned as I backed away, but then I heard the front door creak open. My blood ran cold. Mr. Hensley was back. I darted into a closet, trying to quiet my breathing as his footsteps echoed down the hall. He entered the room and I peered through the slats in the door, watching as he stood in front of the candle, his eyes closed, mumbling those strange words. His face was twisted into an expression of fierce concentration, and as he chanted, the candle's flame grew brighter, casting an ominous glow around the room. Then, without warning, he stopped and turned, his eyes staring directly at the closet door. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't wait for him to make a move. I burst out of the closet, shoving past him and sprinting down the hall. He called after me, his voice laced with fury, but I didn't look back. I ran out of the apartment building and didn't stop until I was far enough away to catch my breath. I never went back to that apartment. I left everything I owned and stayed at a friend's place until I could find a new place to live. Every so often, I'd wake in a cold sweat, haunted by the image of those photos, of his face staring right at me. But the worst part? Sometimes late at night, I still hear his voice. It was meant to be an easy camping weekend. A simple hike and a few nights under the stars with Emma, my girlfriend, and our friends Ben and Sarah. We'd driven out early to the Blue Ridge Mountains, well into a quiet part of the trails that would give us all the space we needed to unplug. The first night was perfect. We set up our tents, shared ghost stories around the fire, and laughed until the stars blanketed the sky above us. That night, after everyone had drifted to sleep, I lay in the dark listening to the subtle sounds of the forest. There was a peacefulness there, the quiet sort you can only find far away from city lights and highways. I closed my eyes and let that silence carry me into sleep, sure that we were the only people for miles. In the morning, Ben suggested we explore a trail he'd read about, one that supposedly led to hidden waterfalls. It wasn't on any map, but he'd found a mention of it online and insisted we should check it out. Emma and I were hesitant. The path was overgrown, almost hidden by the forest's dense undergrowth. But Ben's enthusiasm was contagious and we eventually gave in. The further we hiked, the quieter the forest became. The birdsong that had filled the morning faded, and the air grew thicker, almost stale, as the canopy above darkened. About half an hour in, we noticed a distinct change. The trees grew taller, their trunks gnarled and thick, twisted in ways that seemed almost unnatural. The light filtering through the branches cast a strange, muted glow, and shadows stretched long and foreboding across the ground. When we reached a small clearing, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. In the middle of that empty space stood a tree older and more massive than anything I'd ever seen. Its bark was dark and worn, twisted in places, with branches that seemed to claw at the sky. At its base, a circle of rocks sat arranged with unsettling precision, and among them were a few scattered animal bones picked clean. It looked like the aftermath of some wild animal's kill, but something about it felt wrong. Emma held onto my arm, her grip tightening. I could tell she felt it too, that uneasiness that settled deep in the pit of my stomach. Ben brushed it off, saying that we were probably just nervous because of how quiet it was. But I knew it was more than that. It wasn't just quiet, it was silent, and there was something almost oppressive about it, like the forest was holding its breath. Sarah too seemed uneasy. She whispered that we should head back, that it didn't feel safe to stay here. So we turned around, trying to retrace our steps, but the path we'd come from was gone. No familiar markers, no broken branches. It was as if the trail had vanished entirely. Ben tried to keep calm, telling us that we just needed to keep walking. But the more we walked, the darker the forest became. Even though it was midday, it felt like dusk. Hours passed, and we found ourselves deeper in the trees, surrounded by shadows and thick branches that seemed to close in around us. The forest floor had grown harder to navigate, tangled with roots and bushes that twisted around our feet. I checked my phone, but it had no signal and the GPS wouldn't load. Anxiety prickled at the edges of my mind, gnawing away at the confidence I'd had that morning. Eventually, we stopped to catch our breath. I glanced around, taking in the forest, and that's when I realized there was something, or someone, out there. I kept seeing movement in my peripheral vision, faint and distant, but every time I turned my head, there was nothing. Just shadows and trees. But the feeling lingered, the nagging certainty that we weren't alone. Then the sounds began. At first, it was just a faint rustling, the kind that could easily be dismissed as a breeze stirring the leaves. But the air was still, and the rustling grew louder, coming from all around us. It wasn't just one source. It seemed like something was circling, moving in tandem with our steps. Every time we stopped, it stopped. When we walked, it resumed, always just a little out of reach. Emma's breathing grew quick and shallow, and I could feel my own pulse pounding in my chest. It felt as though we were being watched, as if the trees themselves had eyes hidden among the leaves. I tried to reason with myself, to tell myself that it was just animals or maybe our nerves getting the best of us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, a presence that didn't belong in the forest. As night began to fall, we set up a small camp, lighting a fire to keep the darkness at bay. But the fire's light barely reached beyond the edges of our circle, and the shadows pressed in, thick and unyielding. I sat beside Emma, trying to calm her as we huddled together, each of us peering into the dark, waiting for some sign of familiarity, for any hint that we could find our way back. It was around midnight when I thought I heard footsteps. They were faint, but they echoed around us, the crunch of leaves and snap of twigs, like something moving slowly, deliberately. I strained my ears, but when I turned to look, there was only the firelight and the forest, blanketed in shadows. But the footsteps continued, circling us in the dark, closer each time. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear those steps again, just out of reach, or feel that prickle on the back of my neck, that sense of being watched. I wasn't the only one. The others lay awake too, each of us clinging to the fire's dying warmth. At dawn, we packed up and started moving, desperate to find a way out. But as we stumbled through the trees, it felt like we were going in circles. Familiar landmarks would reappear, and I was sure I'd seen certain trees more than once. Every time we thought we'd found a way out, the path would twist back on itself, leading us deeper instead of out. We finally stumbled back to our original campsite late in the afternoon, exhausted and nearly delirious. Relief washed over me, but that feeling quickly vanished when I saw the ground around our tents. There, scattered in a wide circle, were deep imprints in the dirt. Footprints, or at least they looked like footprints, but larger and deeper than any of ours. They were perfectly spaced, as if something had walked around our tents all night, watching us. We didn't stay to pack up the tents or clean up. We left everything, grabbed only our phones and wallets, and hiked out as fast as we could. The way back was quick and unnaturally easy, as if the forest had finally let us go. By the time we reached the trailhead, I was too tired to feel anything but relief. I still think about that night sometimes, how close we were to something. I don't know if it was just our nerves or if the forest was playing tricks on us. But I do know one thing, I'll never set foot in those woods again. A few months ago, I started renting out a small one-bedroom apartment in an old brick building in Seattle. It was close to work and cheap, so despite its age and creaky floors, I jumped at the chance. I'd been living there for about a week when my landlord, Mrs. Robbins, suggested installing a few security cameras. Just in the hallways and lobby, she assured me, explaining that recent break-ins in the area had made her anxious. It seemed reasonable, and I didn't mind the added security. She set them up the following day, and everything was fine for a while. The building was quiet, and most of the residents kept to themselves. I didn't even think about the cameras after the first week, until strange things started happening. It was little stuff at first. A couple of times, I'd come home to find my apartment door unlocked. I'd shrug it off, figuring I'd forgotten to lock it, even though I knew I hadn't. But then, things would seem just slightly out of place. A chair pulled out from the table, a light turned on that I knew I'd turned off. Once, my phone charger went missing, only to turn up the next morning in the middle of the kitchen floor. Then, one night as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard faint footsteps outside my door. I froze, listening, my heart pounding. The sound was distinct, slow, shuffling steps that moved back and forth, like someone pacing in the hallway. I sat up and crept quietly to the door, but as soon as I got close, the footsteps stopped. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing. The next morning, I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just the building settling or some night owl passing by. But that nagging feeling of unease lingered, and I decided to check the hallway security footage just to put my mind at ease. Mrs. Robbins had given each tenant access to their floor's camera, so I logged in and rewound the footage to the night before, around the time I'd heard the footsteps. The footage was grainy, but I could make out the empty hallway clearly enough. I played it back, watching closely. For the first few minutes, there was nothing. Then at 1:07 a.m. I saw it. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway, barely within view. They were standing still, facing away from the camera, just a shadowy outline against the wall. A chill ran down my spine. I watched as the figure slowly turned and took a few shuffling steps forward, moving down the hall. They stopped directly outside my door. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the screen as the figure lingered there, unmoving, for nearly a full minute. Then, in a single jerky movement, they stepped back, turned around, and walked out of view. I shut my laptop, my heart racing. It didn't make sense. I didn't recognize the figure, but something about the way they moved was off, like they were struggling to keep their balance. I didn't sleep much that night, listening for any sign of those footsteps returning. The next day I tried to brush it off again. Maybe it was just another tenant or someone who'd gotten lost. But that night it happened again. This time I was woken up around 2 a.m. by the sound of a faint scraping, like something heavy being dragged down the hall. The noise stopped outside my door, followed by that same unnerving silence. The next morning I decided to check the footage again. I opened my laptop, hands slightly trembling, and scrolled to 2 a.m. I hit play and there it was, the figure once again standing at the end of the hall. This time they were facing the camera directly, just barely illuminated by the dim hallway lights. I couldn't see any details, but something about their stance, the way their head was tilted slightly to the side, made my skin crawl. The figure stood there for a long time, just staring at the camera. Then they turned and walked down the hallway, their gait slow and deliberate, stopping once again outside my door. But this time they raised a hand. The figure placed it flat against my door, pressing slowly, almost like they were testing it. They stood that way, hand against the door, for nearly a full minute before they finally backed away and disappeared from the screen. I closed the laptop, my chest tight with fear. I felt like I was being watched, even during the day, like there was someone or something out there that knew I'd seen them. The next night, I was determined to catch them. I stayed up, sitting quietly by the door, waiting. Around 3 a.m. I heard it again, that shuffling, scraping sound. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear every movement outside. Then I saw the doorknob slowly turn. I held my breath, gripping a flashlight in my hand, prepared to confront whatever was on the other side. But the knob stopped, paused, as if whoever was on the other side had sensed me. I stayed frozen, hardly daring to breathe, and after a moment the knob turned back. The figure backed away, the footsteps receding down the hall. The next morning, I went straight to Mrs. Robbins, explaining the situation. She looked skeptical but agreed to check the footage with me. We sat in her office, scrolling through the previous night's recording. When we reached 3 a.m., the footage showed the empty hallway, silent and still. No figure, no shuffling, no hand on the doorknob. My mouth went dry as I watched, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. "There's nothing here," Mrs. Robbins said, her voice laced with concern. "Maybe you just imagined it?" But I knew what I'd seen. I could still feel the chill of those moments outside my door, could still see the faint shadow pressing against the screen in my mind's eye. For the next week, I slept with my bedroom door locked and kept the hallway lights on, avoiding the camera footage altogether. But a few nights later, I heard the noise again. Footsteps coming and going outside my door each night around 3 a.m. like clockwork. Unable to sleep, I tried calling the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing out of place, no signs of anyone having been there at all. After that, I made the decision to move out as soon as my lease was up. I left that apartment behind, but every so often when I'm lying in bed late at night, I think I hear the faint sound of shuffling steps right outside my door. It was late, almost 11 p.m. by the time I finally got out of the grocery store. I had stayed back at work that night, catching up on a few things, and ended up stopping by the store on my way home to pick up some last-minute items for the weekend. The store parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of cars parked under the dim glow of the old streetlights. I usually avoid being out alone that late, but the store was only a few minutes from my apartment, and the lot was quiet. The air was thick with that heavy silence you only find late at night, when even the hum of the nearby highway seems distant and faint. As I loaded my bags into the trunk, I felt a faint prickling on the back of my neck like I was being watched. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the time of night, making me jumpy. But then, as I went to shut the trunk, I saw a figure out of the corner of my eye, standing near the edge of the lot. He was far enough away that I couldn't see his face clearly, just his outline in the dim light. He was tall, dressed in a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, standing perfectly still and facing my direction. I told myself it was just another late-night shopper, but something about the way he was positioned, motionless, watching, made me feel uneasy. I got into my car and quickly locked the doors, glancing in the rearview mirror. He was still there, standing in the same spot, staring. I waited a few seconds, hoping he'd turn and walk away, but he didn't move. I felt a sudden urge to get out of there, to put some distance between myself and this stranger, so I started the car and pulled out of the parking spot. As I drove towards the exit, I couldn't resist one last glance at my rearview mirror. He was gone. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe he was just a passerby, maybe he had left. But as I turned onto the road, my headlights swept over the empty stretch of pavement, and I saw him again, standing near the exit, watching as I drove past. I swallowed, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread as I continued down the road. The night felt colder, darker, the shadows along the roadside stretching long and twisted. I kept glancing at the mirrors, trying to reassure myself that he was nowhere in sight, that he was just a random stranger, not someone to worry about. But then, as I neared the turn to my street, I saw him again. This time he was further up the road, just standing on the sidewalk, facing my direction. It was impossible. There was no way he could have gotten there ahead of me. I hadn't seen any other cars, and I hadn't stopped at any lights. But there he was, like he had been waiting. My hands tightened on the wheel as I drove past, forcing myself to keep looking straight ahead. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I resisted the urge to check the rearview mirror, certain that if I did, I'd see him there watching. When I finally reached my apartment complex, I pulled into my usual parking spot, cutting the engine and sitting there in silence, my eyes darting around the lot. There was no sign of him, just the familiar rows of cars and the faint glow of the building's hallway lights. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a weird coincidence. Still, I grabbed my bags quickly and made my way inside, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and by the time I reached my door, I was practically sprinting. I let out a shaky breath once I was safely inside, locking the door behind me and setting down the bags. As I put away the groceries, I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see him down in the lot, watching. But all I saw was the empty parking lot, silent and still. After a while, I managed to calm myself down. I settled onto the couch, telling myself it had all just been a series of odd coincidences. I even laughed at myself, thinking I'd let my imagination get the best of me. I tried to watch some TV, hoping it would take my mind off things. But then I heard it, a soft knock on my door. I froze, my heart hammering. The knock was gentle, almost polite, like someone trying not to disturb a sleeping person. I waited, holding my breath, hoping it was just a neighbor. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I stood up, tiptoeing quietly to the door, and pressed my ear against it. Silence. After a few moments, I took a deep breath, my hand shaking as I slowly peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. There was no one there, just the dim light casting long shadows across the carpeted floor. I backed away from the door, my skin prickling. I was sure I'd heard the knock, sure that someone had been there. I decided to ignore it, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me, some lingering paranoia from the parking lot. But then, at nearly 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it was the sound of shuffling footsteps just outside my door, followed by a soft, almost inaudible scrape, like something brushing against the doorframe. I sat up in bed, every nerve on edge, straining to hear. The sounds continued for a few minutes, soft and steady, like someone pacing back and forth. I didn't dare move, barely breathing, hoping that whoever it was would go away. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The next morning, I checked the hallway, hoping to find some explanation, maybe a maintenance notice or something that would make sense of what I'd heard. But the hall was empty, and the other tenants I spoke to hadn't heard a thing. I never saw that stranger again after that night, but every so often, when I come home late and park in that dimly lit lot, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes, just as I'm reaching for my door, I'll hear those same soft footsteps echoing down the hall behind me, never close enough to see, but just near enough to remind me that I'm not alone. It was a cold November night, and I was standing at the bus stop, shivering in my coat. The streets were empty, and a thin fog had started to settle, turning the streetlights into faint, blurry halos. I'd missed the last direct bus home and had to wait nearly 40 minutes for the late-night shuttle that ran a slower route across town. There was a quiet stillness hanging over the street, the kind that always makes you feel alone, even in a busy city. Occasionally, a car would pass, but otherwise, it was just me, the empty benches, and the soft hum of the distant freeway. I pulled out my phone, but the battery was dead. It had been a long day, and I'd forgotten to charge it. After what felt like ages, I finally saw headlights in the distance. I exhaled in relief as the bus slowly pulled up to the stop. It looked older than the usual buses, a bit worn out, with faded lettering on the side. The destination sign on the front was broken, just a flickering display that didn't show any text. I was the only one getting on. As I climbed aboard, I noticed the driver didn't acknowledge me, his eyes fixed straight ahead. I dropped my fare into the machine and took a seat near the middle. The bus was almost completely empty, just one other passenger sitting near the back, head down, face obscured by the hood of their jacket. The bus doors closed with a heavy sigh, and we pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly into the fog-covered streets. I leaned back, letting my eyes wander out the window, watching the city lights blur past as we made our way through the quieter neighborhoods. I hadn't ridden this late-night shuttle before, but I figured I'd recognize the streets eventually. But as we kept moving, I realized the scenery wasn't changing in the way I expected. Instead of familiar landmarks, we seemed to be driving through nearly identical streets lined with dark, unlit houses and empty storefronts. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, but everything outside was coated in that thick fog, distorting the view. 20 minutes passed, and I still didn't recognize a single street. I glanced up toward the driver, but he seemed entirely focused, his eyes never leaving the road. Something about his rigid posture unsettled me, as if he were more machine than man, driving on autopilot. When I looked back, I noticed the other passenger for the first time. They were sitting motionless, head still down, face hidden. I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't moved at all since I'd boarded, hadn't even shifted in their seat. I took a deep breath, telling myself that I was just tired, that I'd see something familiar soon. But as the bus rolled through another stretch of deserted street, a creeping sense of unease settled over me. The fog was thicker now, and the streetlights seemed dimmer, casting an eerie yellow glow over the empty roads. I checked my watch. We'd been driving for nearly 45 minutes. By now, I should have been close to home, but nothing about this route was familiar. I stood up and walked carefully to the front of the bus, gripping the overhead rail as the bus bounced slightly over a pothole. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the silent bus. The driver didn't respond, his face expressionless, his eyes locked onto the road. I tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me, sir, where exactly are we headed?" He didn't even blink. My stomach twisted as I waited for a response, any sign that he'd heard me. But he kept staring forward, his hands gripping the wheel in a way that seemed almost unnatural, like they were molded to it. Panicking slightly, I turned back to look at the other passenger, hoping for some reassurance. But they hadn't moved, still slouched with their head down as if they hadn't heard me at all. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I could feel the air growing stale, thicker, harder to breathe. It was as if the bus itself had taken on a life of its own, cutting through the fog toward some unknown destination. I decided to sit back down and wait it out, hoping that whatever strange detour we were taking would end soon. But as the minutes dragged on, the bus only seemed to sink deeper into unfamiliar streets, the fog swallowing up any recognizable landmark. There was a sense of isolation, like we were the only people left in the world, endlessly looping through the same roads with no end in sight. After what felt like hours, I looked up and saw a glimmer of movement outside. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, figures standing on the side of the road. I blinked, trying to focus, but they disappeared as soon as I looked directly at them. I turned to the driver, desperate for some answer, but his expression remained blank, almost lifeless. Unable to sit still any longer, I got up and approached the doors, gripping the rail to steady myself. "Please," I said, voice shaking, "I need to get off." But the driver ignored me, his gaze fixed forward as if I wasn't even there. Just then I felt a tap on my shoulder. I froze, heart racing, and turned slowly. The passenger at the back of the bus had finally moved, their head now raised just enough for me to glimpse their face. Pale, gaunt, eyes sunken and staring straight at me. A shiver ran through me. Their lips parted slightly as if they were about to speak, but no sound came out. For a second we just stared at each other, and then in the faintest whisper, I heard them say, "You can't leave." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the seat as I tried to back away. The passenger's eyes followed me, unblinking, their face now twisted in an expression that was almost pity. I reached the front of the bus and grabbed onto the door handle, pulling with all my strength. But it wouldn't budge. The doors were locked, sealed tight. "Please?" I shouted, banging my fists against the doors. "Let me off." The bus continued on, indifferent to my panic, gliding through the foggy streets, the lights outside growing dimmer. I looked back at the passenger, but they had lowered their head again, motionless as if they'd never moved. Finally, I felt the bus slowing. My heart leapt with a flicker of hope. We were coming to a stop. The doors hissed open and I practically leapt out, stumbling onto the sidewalk. I turned around, looking up at the driver, but his face was blank, unreadable, as he shut the doors and drove off into the fog. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but the street was completely unfamiliar, lined with abandoned buildings and broken streetlights. I had no idea where I was, and my phone was still dead. I walked for hours before I finally saw a gas station in the distance, its lights flickering like a beacon in the dark. When I finally made it home, exhausted and shaken, I tried to find any information on that bus route, but nothing matched the description of the bus I'd ridden. There were no records of a late-night shuttle, no drivers who fit that description. And ever since that night, I've never taken a bus after dark. But sometimes, when I pass that same stop late at night, I think I can see a faint set of headlights in the distance, flickering through the fog, waiting. After college, I moved into an old apartment building downtown. It was one of those places with a lot of charm, high ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and a dimly lit stairwell that twisted up through the middle of the building. I didn't mind the age of the place. It was affordable and I was close to work. But after a few weeks, I started noticing something odd about the stairwell. The first time it happened, I was coming home late after a night out. The building was silent, except for the soft echo of my footsteps as I climbed the stairs to my floor. I was halfway up when I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I stopped, listening, but the building was empty. I shook it off, chalking it up to too much wine and a tired mind. But then it happened again. This time, I was on my way to work in the morning, the stairwell bathed in faint, early morning light. I was halfway down the stairs when I saw a faint figure on the landing below, just out of the corner of my eye. I froze, squinting, but as soon as I looked directly, there was nothing there. Just an empty stairwell and the worn carpet. After that, I avoided the stairs when I could, preferring the old, painfully slow elevator. But every once in a while, when I was in a hurry or if the elevator was taking too long, I'd use the stairwell. Each time, I'd feel that same creeping sensation like I was never quite alone. It wasn't overwhelming, just enough to put me on edge. Then one night, the feeling escalated. I'd stayed late at work to finish a project and came home exhausted, trudging up the stairs to my apartment. I was nearly at the 4th floor when I heard it, soft, echoing footsteps behind me. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The steps stopped too, just one flight below. My heart pounded and I turned slowly, peering down the stairwell. There was nothing there, just empty stairs and the dim glow of the hallway lights. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd imagined it. I turned back, trying to shake the unease that was settling in my stomach. But as I started up again, the footsteps resumed. They matched my pace perfectly, each step echoing in unison with mine. I walked faster, the footsteps following. I reached my door, fumbling with the key, glancing over my shoulder. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl. Finally, I slipped into my apartment, locking the door behind me and leaning against it, trying to calm my breathing. After that, I became paranoid about the stairwell. I started avoiding it altogether, even when the elevator was painfully slow. I tried telling myself it was all in my head, that I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. But a part of me knew something was wrong, that there was something off about the stairwell. Then about a month later, my worst fear came true. The elevator was out of order and I had no choice but to take the stairs. It was late again and the building was silent. I took a deep breath and started up, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. As I reached the 3rd floor, I felt that familiar prickling on my neck, stronger than ever. I tried to ignore it, forcing myself to keep walking. But as I neared the 4th floor landing, I saw it. A figure standing just around the corner, motionless, barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat. I slowed down, staring, unable to move. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't move an inch. It was just standing there, partially hidden by the wall, as if it were waiting for me. The hallway light cast a faint glow over what little I could see, just a dark outline, slightly hunched, its head tilted at an odd angle. I took a step back, not daring to look away. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind spinning. I thought about turning back, but something in me knew that if I did, it would follow. I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm, and took another step forward, keeping my eyes on the figure. As I reached the top of the landing, it slowly stepped back, retreating into the shadows, almost as if it were giving me space to pass. I didn't dare look directly at it, afraid that if I acknowledged it, it might do something worse. I kept my gaze straight ahead, walking as quickly and quietly as I could. I made it to my door and fumbled with my keys, heart pounding in my chest. The hallway behind me was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, watching. I finally managed to unlock the door and slipped inside, slamming it shut and locking it as quickly as I could. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in bed, listening, every creak of the building sending my heart racing. But the next morning, I was determined not to let it get to me. I started using the elevator exclusively, even if it meant waiting 5 or 10 minutes. One night, about a week later, I saw an older resident, Mrs. Cohen, waiting at the elevator with me. She looked tired, clutching a small shopping bag. I hadn't spoken much to my neighbors, but as we waited, she turned to me with a weary smile. "Elevator's slow, isn't it?" she said. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "The stairwell's faster, but..." She nodded, giving me a knowing look. "Ah, the stairwell. Not many people use it, you know. Especially at night." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, glancing around before lowering her voice. "People say they've seen things there. Just shadows mostly. A feeling of not being alone. She shrugged, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, something uneasy. The elevator finally arrived, and we both stepped in, the heavy silence settling over us as it ascended. I never asked her anything else about it, but her words stayed with me, confirming what I'd felt all along. Even now, I avoid that stairwell. Sometimes, when I walk past it on my way to the elevator, I can feel that same prickling sensation, like something is watching me from just around the corner. And every once in a while, I'll hear a faint, echoing step that sounds too close, like someone is waiting there in the dark for the right moment to follow me again. When my wife and I moved into our new home, a charming old craftsman-style house on the edge of town, we were thrilled. The place had character, high ceilings, elegant woodwork, and a small attic for extra storage. The realtor had warned us about the drafts, but we figured that was normal for a house this age. In the first week, we were busy settling in and adjusting to the creaks and groans that seemed to come with the place. But after a few nights, I started hearing something strange. It began late at night, just around midnight, faint footsteps coming from the attic. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone were pacing back and forth. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. But as the nights passed, the footsteps became more distinct, more insistent, always right above our heads. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, I went up to investigate. I climbed the narrow attic stairs, flashlight in hand, my heart racing. When I pushed open the attic door, the air was colder, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. I swept the flashlight around, my skin prickling as the beam hit each dusty corner, revealing nothing but empty boxes and cobwebs. But then I noticed something odd, faint footprints in the thick dust, leading back and forth across the attic floor. I backed out quickly, shutting the door and trying to shake the image of those footprints. The next night, my wife heard the footsteps too. She woke me up, clutching my arm, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We lay there together, listening to the slow, steady pacing above us. I assured her it was just the house, that maybe an animal had found its way inside, but I knew that wasn't true. I tried everything I could think of. I checked the attic every morning, even sprinkled flour on the floor, hoping to catch any trace of what was causing the noise. But by morning, the flour remained undisturbed, even though the footsteps resumed each night, just as loud and clear as before. Finally, one night, I decided to wait in the attic. I went up alone, trying to keep my footsteps light as I moved to a shadowed corner. I clicked off the flashlight and sat, heart pounding, waiting for any sign of movement. After what felt like an eternity, I heard it, a creak from across the attic, a quiet, almost hesitant step. My blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't just the house settling. Someone was in the attic with me. I held my breath, waiting, straining to see in the dim light. The footsteps drew closer, slow and measured, like they knew I was there, waiting. The silence stretched, so tense I could feel it pressing against my chest. And then, just a few feet away, a shadow shifted, a figure barely visible moving toward me. I scrambled back, bumping into a box, the noise startling in the quiet. But the figure didn't move, only stood there, watching me with a presence so heavy it felt suffocating. I couldn't stay there. I stumbled to my feet and bolted for the door, throwing it shut behind me, heart racing as I fled back downstairs. I could feel the weight of that figure's presence even after the door was closed, as if it were still up there, listening, waiting. The next day I couldn't ignore it anymore. I told my wife everything, from the footprints to the presence in the attic. She listened, her face growing paler by the second, but agreed that we had to figure out what was happening. We decided to check the attic again together, in the daylight this time, hoping that somehow it would be less terrifying. But when we went up, something had changed. The footprints were back, fresh and more numerous than before, like someone had been pacing in circles all night. And there, on the far wall, was something we hadn't noticed before. A A small, old door set into the wall, barely big enough for a person to fit through. It was slightly ajar, a faint, icy draft seeping through the gap. My wife reached for my arm, her grip tight. "Did you know about that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. I shook my head, every instinct telling me to leave, to shut the attic door and never look back. But part of me needed to know what was behind that door. I moved forward, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I pulled it open, slowly trying to peer inside. But just as I did, we heard it, a low, scraping sound from deep within the shadows, something moving toward us from within the small, dark space. I backed away, slamming the door shut, and my wife and I fled down the stairs, neither of us daring to look back. The sound continued, muffled behind the closed door, like something trapped, waiting. That night, the footsteps were louder than ever, almost frantic, pacing back and forth above us. We didn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shift in the shadows made us jump. By morning, we had our decision. We were leaving. Before we left, I told our realtor about the sounds, the hidden door. She listened quietly, her expression growing uneasy, but said nothing. As we handed over the keys, she murmured, "This house has been through many owners, and most of them only stayed for a short time." We didn't ask any more questions. We left that house and never looked back. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I still hear those footsteps in my mind, steady and insistent, like a call waiting for me to return. It was supposed to be a quick drive to my sister's place, just a few hours through back roads. But halfway there, the sky darkened and a relentless rain began to pour. The back roads quickly became treacherous, and visibility dropped to almost nothing as the rain hammered against my windshield. I knew I'd have to pull over soon, but there was nothing around. No gas stations, no roadside diners, just thick woods lining the narrow road. After another mile, I spotted something through the rain, the faint outline of an old house set back from the road. Desperate for a break, I pulled into the driveway, parking near the front. The house was tall and imposing, with peeling paint and windows that looked like hollowed-out eyes in the dim light. But I didn't have any other options. I figured I could wait out the worst of the storm before heading back on the road. As I approached, I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried the handle, and it creaked open easily, revealing a dark, dusty hallway. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying a faint smell of mold and something metallic. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by what little daylight managed to pierce through the rain. "Hello?" I called out, but only silence replied. I stepped inside, leaving wet footprints on the dusty floor, and took a few cautious steps into the foyer. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, and there were old portraits hanging on the walls, their faces blurred and indistinct. A chill ran down my spine as I realized how empty the house felt, like it had been abandoned long ago. I tried to settle in by a corner chair, figuring I'd just wait until the rain lightened up. But as I sat, I heard it, a faint shuffling sound from upstairs, like someone moving slowly, dragging their feet across the floor. My pulse quickened, and I glanced up toward the ceiling, half expecting to see a shadow pass by. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the empty house. The shuffling stopped, but there was no answer. I stood up, straining to listen, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But then the sound started again, heavier this time, closer. The footsteps moved down the stairs, one slow, dragging step at a time. I backed away, glancing at the door, debating whether I should just leave, but a curiosity, or maybe just stubbornness, kept me rooted in place. The footsteps stopped just beyond the corner where the stairs met the hallway, hidden from view. I waited, my heart pounding, but no one appeared. I felt a sudden, pressing urge to move, to leave, to get away from the cold, hollow quiet of that house. But as I turned to go, something on the wall caught my eye. A large, faded portrait of a family, a man, a woman, and a small child, stared back at me. Their expressions were blank, but something about their eyes seemed too real, too aware. And then I noticed something chilling. The background of the portrait was unmistakably the same hallway I was standing in, right down to the wallpaper pattern. It was as if they were standing right where I was. A loud creak sounded behind me, breaking my trance, and I turned sharply, only to find the hallway empty. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could make it to the door, a sharp bang echoed from upstairs, like something heavy had fallen. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and stepped toward the stairs. I told myself I just needed to see what it was, to settle my nerves. As I climbed, the wooden steps groaned beneath my feet, and each creak seemed to echo through the empty house. The upper floor was shrouded in shadow, the dim light barely enough to see more than a few feet ahead. When I reached the landing, I found myself in a long hallway lined with closed doors. The air was colder here, heavier. I walked slowly, peering into each room I passed. A bedroom with an old, dusty bed, a study with scattered papers on the floor, a bathroom with a cracked mirror. Each room felt frozen in time, like the people who'd lived here had left in a hurry and never returned. Then I noticed one door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. I approached it slowly, my skin prickling with a sense of dread. I pushed it open, revealing a small room that looked like a child's bedroom. Toys lay scattered on the floor, and a small bed sat against the wall, neatly made but covered in a thick layer of dust. And there, on the bed, was a single faded doll. Its glass eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, its dress worn and frayed. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, and I turned to leave, but froze when I heard a soft, barely audible whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was faint, almost like a breath, but it sent a chill down my spine. I looked around the room, but it was empty, save for the doll and the faint outline of my own reflection in the cracked window. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding, every instinct telling me to leave as quickly as possible. I turned and hurried down the hallway, but as I reached the stairs, I heard the footsteps again, coming from behind me. They were faster this time, like someone was following me, closing the distance with each step. I practically flew down the stairs, my hand gripping the railing as I stumbled onto the ground floor. I didn't look back as I rushed toward the door, yanking it open and darting into the rain. I dashed to my car, heart pounding, and fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to unlock the door. As I got in and slammed the door shut, I glanced back at the house one last time. Through the rain-soaked windshield, I saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching me. They were shadowed, their face obscured, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and cold, as if they were marking my presence, watching me leave. I didn't wait to find out anything more. I threw the car into gear and sped down the road, not stopping until I was miles away, the house just a dark silhouette fading into the rain behind me. Since that night, I've had nightmares about that house, about the footsteps, the whisper, the figure watching me through the window. I don't know who or what was in that house, but every time it rains, I'm reminded of that hollow gaze, of the feeling that I was never meant to be there. And sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, I think I can still hear those footsteps, closing in step by slow, deliberate step. It started out innocently enough, or so I thought. When the doorbell rang that first time, I wasn't expecting a delivery, but when I opened the door, a courier stood there holding a small brown package with my name on it. I hadn't ordered anything, yet the address and name were unmistakably mine. I took the package from him, feeling a slight unease as he held it out to me with a polite, almost robotic smile. Inside the package was something I'd been meaning to order but hadn't yet. A new phone charger, the exact model I'd looked up online just the night before. The coincidence was odd, but I didn't dwell on it, figuring it might be a gift from someone who knew me well. But the next day, another package arrived. This time, it was a leather-bound notebook, one I'd also browsed online the week before. No note, no return address. Just another box with my name on it, brought by the same courier, who wore that same neutral, vaguely polite expression. The packages began arriving more frequently after that. Every other day, sometimes twice a day, the doorbell would ring, and there would be the same courier holding a new package just for me. Each item was eerily in tune with my recent searches, conversations, or random thoughts. A set of pens, a specific brand of coffee mug, a book I had once read a review about. Each package felt more personal, each delivery too perfectly timed to be a coincidence. One evening, after yet another package, I tried to ask the courier about the sender. He only blinked, his polite smile unwavering, but his eyes seemed to linger a little too long. His response was oddly vague, almost like he hadn't truly processed the question. I found myself questioning the reliability of this seemingly benign stranger who showed up at my door with disturbing consistency, yet who had no answers, no personality, no explanation. A week later, the doorbell rang again. But this time, as I held the package, an unsettling feeling crept up my spine. Inside was a framed photograph. It was a picture of me standing on my balcony in my own home, taken from a distance that suggested someone had been watching from across the street. My heart raced as I realized the level of intrusion this represented. Someone had taken the time to photograph me, print it, frame it, and send it to my doorstep. I shut the door and drew the blinds, feeling as though every corner, every shadow held secrets that weren't mine. By then I was sleeping poorly. Every creak of the house seemed louder, every shadow felt more sinister. I began scanning every incoming package for clues, trying to catch even a hint of the sender's identity, but there was nothing, just my name in that same generic font. I spent hours searching online, combing through past orders, trying to find any trace of where they were coming from, but there was nothing. The delivery company had no record of the packages, and my calls only confirmed what I feared. These packages had no documented sender. Then the deliveries escalated. One night, the box I found on my doorstep contained a simple handwritten note on a plain piece of paper. Asterisk, I see you're sleeping well. You look best when you're thinking of me. Asterisk, the word sent a cold dread through me, the kind that sinks deep and stays. It wasn't just the thought of being watched. It was the fact that someone seemed to know every detail of my life, right down to my thoughts. It was as if they'd become part of my home, my mind, and I couldn't shut them out. The next day, I reached out to the police, explaining everything. They came to investigate, but could find no evidence of tampering, no signs of forced entry, no cameras, and no suspicious devices. I could feel their skepticism as they offered reassurances, the suggestion that I might be overreacting left hanging in the air. But I couldn't dismiss it. My sense of unease had spiraled into full-blown fear. That night, I barricaded my doors, feeling trapped within my own walls, desperately hoping this would be enough. But it wasn't. 2 nights later, I returned home late, only to find yet another package sitting on my doormat, but this time with a familiar but chilling addition, a small silver key. I recognized it immediately. It was the spare key I kept hidden under a loose floorboard in my closet. Inside the box was another note, simple and chilling. Asterisk, no need for this anymore. I've already let myself in. Asterisk. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. Without even packing a bag, I bolted, sprinting down the stairs and out into the street, never once looking back. I kept running, the note and the packages haunting my every step. It was past midnight when I realized my gas tank was dangerously low. The highway was dark and empty, with no sign of life for miles, and fatigue was pressing down on me after a long workday. Relief washed over me when I spotted a faint gas station sign flickering up ahead, even though the thought of stopping at a lonely station in the middle of nowhere wasn't exactly comforting. As I pulled in, the place looked practically abandoned. One dim streetlight buzzed above the pumps, casting an eerie, shifting light. The small store attached to the station had its blinds drawn, and everything was quiet, too quiet. I got out to pump gas, keeping my eyes on the numbers, trying to ignore the creeping unease in my stomach. Then I saw it, a beat-up old sedan parked a few pumps away. Its windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't make out anyone inside. The car wasn't running and no one had stepped out, yet something about it felt wrong. I caught myself glancing at it, expecting someone to emerge, but nothing happened. After filling up, I swiped my card, paid quickly, and hopped back into my car. I started the engine, and that's when the headlights of the sedan suddenly flared to life. My breath caught. I told myself it was just another late-night driver, but the timing was uncanny, as if they had been waiting for me. I slowly pulled out, my heart pounding, and within seconds the sedan eased out of its spot and slid in behind me. My pulse quickened. I took a few turns at random, testing to see if it was following me by chance. But every twist and curve I took, that car shadowed me, staying just far enough back to make it seem like a coincidence, if it weren't for how perfectly it matched my every move. Nervously, I picked up speed, hoping to lose them. But the headlights behind me grew brighter as they sped up too, closing in. The road stretched empty ahead, and my fear turned into dread as the car trailed closer, its lights glaring, flooding my rearview mirror. It felt like they were trying to drive me somewhere, off the road maybe, somewhere I couldn't be seen. Finally, I took a sharp turn onto a narrow side road, praying the sudden move would throw them off. But as soon as I rounded the corner, I saw two things. The road abruptly dead-ended, and the headlights from the sedan appeared right behind me, bright as ever. They must have known I'd end up here. I slammed on the brakes, watching in horror as the sedan pulled up just inches away. The car's headlights blinked off, and suddenly I was plunged into total darkness. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, feeling the suffocating weight of silence press around me. Whoever was in that car wasn't moving, but they were there. I could feel it. I forced myself to look back, straining to make out any hint of movement inside the car. Then, just as my eyes began to adjust, a faint shadow shifted in the driver's seat. I caught the briefest glimpse of a pale face, staring directly at me through the windshield, lips stretched into a wide, unnaturally stiff smile. I couldn't make out their eyes, only that smile so wide it looked painful. Terrified, I fumbled for my phone, planning to call the police, but as I lifted it, the headlights from the sedan snapped back on, blinding me. My phone slipped from my hand and landed on the floor. Panic surged as I scrambled to grab it, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. Just as I lifted my head, I saw the sedan's driver's side door begin to open, slowly, creaking as if it hadn't been used in years. I was frozen, heart pounding in my ears as a figure stepped out, still cloaked in shadows. All I could see was that awful smile, unnaturally wide and directed at me, as they began to walk slowly, deliberately toward my car. In that moment, something snapped. I threw my car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed up, desperate to escape. The figure halted, still watching as if amused. The distance between us stretched, but then they lifted a hand, pointing right at me, a gesture that felt like a promise more than a threat. I sped past the sedan, the figure's hand still raised, pointing until they vanished from view. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on the main road with cars and streetlights in the distance. I dared one last glance in the mirror, but the road behind me was empty, with no sign of the sedan or the figure. No explanation. Just the lingering image of that wide, unnatural smile burned into my mind. Since that night, I never drive that road past sunset, and I always keep my gas tank full. Part of me wonders if that figure was waiting for someone, anyone, to stop at that isolated station. But another part of me dreads the idea that they might have been waiting specifically for me, and that next time I won't be able to get away. Moving into the old Victorian house seemed like a dream come true. The place was spacious, affordable, and even came with its antique charm, squeaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and the kind of drafty corners that made the air feel alive. I moved in on a rainy weekend, thrilled to finally have my own place, even if it meant dealing with the occasional creak or groan of an aging home. At first, the strange sounds felt almost comforting, part of the old house's personality. But within the first few nights, they grew harder to ignore. Around midnight, just as I'd start drifting off to sleep, I'd hear it, a soft thumping sound coming from somewhere above my room. I brushed it off as the wind or settling floorboards, but the thumping continued night after night, always around the same time, always directly above me. One night, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, figuring I'd find a loose beam or a forgotten box. But as soon as I entered, the room was quiet, eerily still. Dust floated in the flashlight's beam, and the only sound was the rain pattering against the roof. I checked the floor, the rafters, even a stack of old crates left by the previous owners, but everything seemed in order. I chalked it up to my imagination, went back downstairs, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, as I made my way downstairs to the kitchen, I noticed something odd. A fine layer of dust on the floor near the attic stairs, with faint footprints tracking through it. My own feet froze, my heart pounding as I tried to remember if I had left those prints the night before. But these were odd, lighter than any I'd have made, almost like someone was tiptoeing. Days passed and the sounds began to escalate. In addition to the thumping, I'd occasionally hear faint shuffling sounds, and even the occasional quiet knock as though someone were tapping from the other side of the wall. Every time I'd sit up in bed, straining my ears, but when I listened harder, everything would fall silent. I began to feel a prickling sense of dread any time I went near the attic stairs, but I kept telling myself it was just an old house. The noise is simply part of its character. Then one evening, as I was reading in the living room, I heard the unmistakable creak of footsteps descending the attic stairs. My blood ran cold. I stood up, staring at the door, waiting for the sound to stop, for it to be just another figment of my imagination. But this time, the footsteps continued, coming down step by step, until they stopped just outside the door to the room I was in. I held my breath, staring at the door, expecting it to swing open or a shadow to appear underneath. But nothing happened. I waited in that terrifying silence for a full minute before finally gathering the courage to swing open the door, only to find an empty hallway staring back at me. The next morning, I tried to dismiss everything as stress or overwork, but something didn't feel right. I started noticing small things out of place. A book on the shelf slightly moved, my phone on the coffee table tilted at an angle, and once, a glass of water I had left by my bedside completely drained by morning. I would have thought I was sleepwalking if it weren't for one chilling fact. I never even drank from that glass before going to bed. One night, determined to put an end to my growing paranoia, I set up my phone to record overnight. If nothing else, I figured a video might give me peace of mind. I went to sleep feeling oddly relieved, like I'd finally get an answer in the morning. When I watched the recording the next day, most of it was silent. For hours, all I saw was the dim outline of my room, the faint sound of my breathing as I slept. But around 2:45 a.m., the faint shuffling sound started. The camera showed nothing, just the shadowed outline of my bedroom. Then a quiet knock sounded from somewhere off camera. My sleeping self shifted slightly but didn't wake up. But then something terrifying happened. The camera stayed still, but on screen the blankets at the foot of my bed seemed to move. Just an inch, but enough to be unmistakable. My heart raced as I watched, my mind desperately searching for an explanation. The blankets moved again, a small tug that made them ripple as though someone invisible had briefly clenched them in their hand. And then it stopped. Everything went silent, and the rest of the footage was just me lying there, oblivious. I turned off the video, my hands shaking. There was no way to rationalize it anymore. I wasn't alone in the house. That night, I locked my bedroom door and kept the lights on. But around midnight, the thumping sound from the attic started again, louder than ever, like someone was pacing angrily across the floor. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every nerve in my body tensed, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. At 2:45 a.m., the knocking began, this time directly on my bedroom door. Soft, deliberate taps, as though someone was politely asking to be let in. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would stop, but the knocking continued, more insistent with each tap. Finally, I gathered the courage to whisper, "Who's there?" The tapping stopped, and a heavy silence filled the room. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, just as I started to relax, a faint, rasping voice came from the other side of the door. Just one word, whispered so softly I almost didn't catch it. "Watching. I haven't slept since. I don't go near the attic, and every night I brace myself for the knocking, the footsteps, and the shuffling sounds that haunt me. I don't know who or what lives in this house with me. All I know is that they haven't left." and they're waiting for something just beyond that door. After finally saving up enough, I moved into a modest, single-bedroom apartment in an old building downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm: exposed brick, high ceilings, and an unbeatable location. The building was quiet, occupied mostly by older residents, and I appreciated the calm. That first night, as I lay in bed enjoying the novelty of my new place, I heard a faint knocking sound from somewhere in the wall. It was soft and rhythmic, almost like a distant tapping. I brushed it off as pipes or the wind rattling through the building's old bones, but the knocking continued, a steady beat echoing through the room. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that old buildings just had quirks, and eventually fell asleep. The next few nights, the knocking returned, always around the same time, just as I was drifting off. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, but as the days went on, the knocks seemed to grow louder. I could swear they were closer, clearer, like someone tapping their knuckles against the wall from the other side. I tapped back once, half-jokingly, hoping it might just be a friendly neighbor. But when I stopped, the knocking resumed immediately in the same even rhythm. A few days later, I decided to ask my upstairs neighbor about it. She was a retired schoolteacher, kind but private. When I mentioned the knocking, her face paled. "You hear it too?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, surprised at her reaction. She hesitated, looking down the hallway as if she didn't want anyone to overhear. "I've heard it for years. Sometimes it's loud, other times it's just a faint tapping. I tried reporting it, but maintenance found nothing wrong. It's just there." That evening, I sat in the dark, listening more intently than before. The knocking started right on schedule, just past midnight, tapping out a slow, methodical rhythm. I felt my pulse quicken. I wanted to believe it was just pipes, but the pattern was so intentional. Tap, tap, tap. It would pause, then resume as if waiting for a reaction. As the nights passed, the knocking grew bolder. It seemed to follow me, moving from room to room. If I was in the living room, it was in the wall behind the TV. If I was in the kitchen, it seemed to come from behind the fridge. But always, without fail, it was loudest in the bedroom, right next to my bed. One night, I decided to confront it. I turned off all the lights, sat up in bed, and waited. When the knocking began, I leaned close to the wall and whispered, "Who's there?" Silence. I held my breath, feeling foolish, but then, faintly, I heard a quiet scrape, like fingernails dragging slowly across the wall, followed by 3 soft knocks. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to tap back 3 times. I waited, the silence thickening, and then it responded with 2 slow taps, softer, almost hesitant. The tapping began to feel like a language, a primitive form of communication. I spent hours trying to decipher it, tapping in different rhythms, listening carefully for replies. Each time, the knocks came back in different patterns, sometimes short and hurried, sometimes long and dragging. A few nights later, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. After a series of knocks, the sound would pause, and then I'd hear a faint, raspy whisper. Too quiet to make out words, but unmistakably human. I leaned closer, trying to catch the sounds, but each time the whispers would fade before I could understand. The next day, I went down to the basement where the maintenance room was located, hoping to find answers. The building supervisor, a gruff older man named Ed, was there, and I asked him directly if he'd ever heard anything strange in the walls. He chuckled, shaking his head. "These old buildings creak, that's all," he said dismissively. "People always think they're hearing things. You'd be amazed how many folks call me about noises in the walls." Just as I was about to leave, though, he paused. "But you're on the 5th floor, right? That unit has had a few complaints about noises over the years." He shrugged, unwilling to say more, but the look in his eyes hinted at something unsaid, something he preferred to ignore. That night, the knocking was louder, closer than ever before. It didn't even wait until midnight. This time, it started as soon as I turned off the lights. I was lying in bed when I heard it, just beside my head, clear and sharp. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the knocks kept going harder and faster, as if whatever was behind the wall was trying to break through. Desperately, I grabbed a hammer from the kitchen drawer and approached the wall. I pressed my ear against it, hearing the faint, frantic tapping, now interspersed with those faint whispers. Then, in the silence between knocks, I heard it clearly, two words rasping and low. "Help me." Heart pounding, I swung the hammer, breaking through the drywall. Dust flew up, and I coughed, pulling chunks away until I revealed an empty cavity in the wall. It was dark, cramped, but completely empty. I leaned in, shining a flashlight inside, my hands trembling. As I backed away, feeling foolish and more than a little disturbed, the knocking resumed, this time on the opposite wall, loud, persistent, almost angry. I left the room, unable to stay another second. Since that night, I sleep in the living room with the TV on, refusing to go near the bedroom after dark. The knocking hasn't stopped, but now it feels different. No longer asking for attention, but demanding it, growing louder each night as if angry at being ignored. I don't dare respond. I don't want to know who or what is behind those walls. And each time it knocks, I pray it never finds a way through. A few months back, I decided to book a remote cabin in the mountains for a solo getaway. The idea of complete isolation, no cell service, and a chance to unplug sounded perfect after months of non-stop work. The cabin was nestled in a thick forest by a lake, the nearest town miles away. It was ideal, a cozy one-bedroom place with a fireplace, the lake barely visible through the pine trees, and the constant sound of wind rustling the leaves. I'd even chosen a weekend forecasted for light snow, imagining myself bundled up by the fire with nothing but a few good books. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. I spent the evening wrapped in a blanket by the fire, listening to the quiet, my thoughts finally free of the usual noise and stress. I even left the back porch light on to catch a glimpse of the snow dusting the lake. By midnight, the snowfall had thickened, covering everything in a soft, silent white. The isolation was profound. But then around 3 a.m. I woke up to a noise outside, a faint, shuffling sound. At first I thought it was just the wind kicking up, pushing the snow against the cabin walls. But then the sound grew heavier, like footsteps crunching through the fresh snow, moving slowly around the side of the cabin. My first thought was that a deer or some other animal had wandered close, so I got out of bed, planning to take a quick peek through the window. I barely lifted the curtain, not wanting to scare whatever it was, but there was no animal outside. Just a set of footprints in the fresh snow, trailing off toward the forest. And from where they started, it looked as though they'd come right up to my bedroom window before retreating. I felt a prickle of unease, but after checking the locks, I reassured myself that I was being paranoid. After all, people did hike through these woods, and it was possible someone had passed through before the snow had fully set in. The next morning, though, the sight of those footprints still lingered in my mind. When I went outside to take a look in the daylight, I noticed that the trail hadn't just been near my window. They circled the entire cabin as if someone had walked around it slowly, pausing at each window. The tracks led back toward the woods, where they vanished into a grove of thick, snow-laden trees. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I closed all the curtains, locked the doors twice, and made sure the fireplace was burning, the flames casting a reassuring glow over the room. Just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it again, the sound of crunching footsteps, this time right outside the front porch. I froze, straining to hear. The steps were slow, deliberate, circling around to the back of the cabin, stopping just below the bedroom window. I held my breath, waiting, the silence pressing down on me as I listened for anything, breathing, a voice, anything that could make sense of what I was hearing. But there was only the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and after a long moment, the footsteps faded back toward the woods. The following day, I scoured the snow for more prints. I expected to find the same single set from the night before, but this time, there were several distinct trails, all leading from the tree line to different windows of the cabin. Some of the prints were deeper, as if whoever, or whatever, had been standing there watching for an extended time. By now my nerves were frayed. I debated leaving early, but the snow had piled up, and I wasn't confident I could get my car down the narrow, winding road in these conditions. So that evening I decided to stay up, lights off, positioned near the window with a clear view of the woods. Hours passed in total silence, the snowfall muffling every sound until I thought I might be imagining things. Then just after midnight I saw it, a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible through the falling snow. They were motionless, just watching the cabin. I felt a cold, creeping dread, every instinct in me screaming to move, to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet, my eyes locked on the figure. After what felt like an eternity, the figure began to move toward the cabin, their pace slow but direct. I backed away from the window, not daring to make a sound as they approached the side of the cabin, where I lost sight of them. I listened, and soon the now familiar crunch of snow began again, moving from window to window, the pattern deliberate and unhurried. Suddenly, a loud, metallic scraping sound came from the front porch, followed by a heavy thud against the door, as if someone, or something, was testing its weight. My heart raced as I gripped a heavy fireplace poker, feeling utterly helpless in the small, isolated cabin. The door rattled just a little, as though the lock was being tested. And then silence. Minutes passed, stretched long and tense, until finally, I mustered the courage to inch closer to the window. I lifted the corner of the curtain, my hands shaking, and looked out. The figure was gone, but in the snow just below the porch light was a deep imprint, as though something heavy had leaned against the door. That was enough. At first light, I packed up, abandoning the cabin in favor of the safety of the town below. As I left, I glanced back only once, catching a final glimpse of those footprints circling the cabin, trailing back to the woods like a haunting memory. I never found out who, or what, had visited that night, but I never felt truly alone in those woods again. Last winter, a few friends and I decided to spend a weekend at a remote lodge nestled in the mountains. The lodge was advertised as a cozy, rustic getaway with wood-burning stoves and panoramic views, the perfect retreat for a few days of unwinding. It was run by a retired couple who lived nearby, and they'd promised us a full weekend without any interruptions or other guests. When we arrived, a heavy snowstorm was already starting to settle over the valley, but the lodge was even more charming than expected. There was a main lounge area with tall antique windows that offered a view of the snow-covered pines, and each room had its own fireplace. It seemed like the perfect setup for a relaxing, cozy weekend. The first night, we sat by the lounge fire, chatting and listening to the wind howl outside, filling the lodge with an eerie, muffled silence between gusts. Around midnight, the snowstorm grew stronger and the winds rattled the windows. Then we heard something that didn't fit with the winter storm, a faint sound from somewhere down the long, dimly lit hallway. At first, it was barely noticeable, almost like a soft rustling or scratching. We laughed it off, joking that it was just the old building settling in the storm. But the sound didn't stop. Every few minutes, it would start up again, this time seeming a little closer. It was faint but rhythmic, like footsteps. We brushed it off as our nerves getting the best of us until, an hour later, I got up to grab a drink from the kitchen. As I passed by the hallway, I thought I caught a shadow just at the edge of my vision, slipping away around the corner. I stopped, staring down the empty, dimly lit hallway, my heart racing, every instinct telling me that someone, or something, was standing just out of sight. When I rejoined my friends, I asked if anyone else had seen anything unusual. At first, they all shrugged, but then one of them admitted they'd thought they heard someone whispering near their room. Another friend said they'd seen what they thought was a figure standing by the window earlier, but when they'd looked again, it was gone. We joked about the place being haunted, but there was a lingering unease in the air. That night, we went to our rooms, but I could barely sleep. The wind had picked up, howling and swirling around the lodge, almost like voices. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear that faint, persistent sound again. Footsteps moving slowly through the hall, stopping near my door before fading back down the hallway. At one point, I thought I heard a faint knock, but when I got up to check, no one was there. I returned to bed, unease gnawing at me until I finally dozed off, too exhausted to stay awake. The next morning, we gathered for breakfast, each of us looking pale and tired. Everyone admitted they hadn't slept well, each of us hearing footsteps, faint knocks, or even whispers outside our doors. It was unsettling, but we tried to laugh it off, deciding we'd probably all just spooked each other with stories the night before. Determined to make the most of the day, we headed out for a hike. But when we returned that evening, the storm had intensified, trapping us inside with nearly 2 feet of snow blocking the roads. That night, the atmosphere in the lodge felt heavier, as if the walls were pressing in on us. The windows rattled, and every creak in the building seemed amplified in the silence. Around midnight, just as we were starting to relax again, we heard a loud, deliberate knock on the lounge door. We all froze, staring at the door, waiting for someone to enter. But no one did. The door remained closed, and outside, everything was silent, save for the sound of snow hitting the windows. I mustered the courage to open the door, but there was nothing there, just the dark hallway stretching off into the shadows. The only thing out of place was a faint trail of wet footprints leading down the hall, stopping abruptly in front of each of our doors before disappearing into the shadows. We were too unnerved to sleep after that, so we huddled in the lounge, wide awake, listening to the faint sounds that continued to drift from the hallway. Every so often we'd hear footsteps, soft and measured, as if someone were pacing just outside, waiting. Just before dawn, we heard the last loud knock, this time on the lounge window. We turned, expecting to see someone standing outside, but the only thing we saw was the frosty imprint of a hand on the glass, slowly fading as the first light of dawn broke through the snow. As soon as the storm let up that morning, we packed our things and left, abandoning any hope of a relaxing weekend. To this day, none of us can explain who or what had been pacing the halls of that lodge. But I'll never forget those footprints leading to each of our doors, or the feeling of being watched, like something just outside the warmth of the fire was waiting to be invited in. A few winters ago, I booked a solo weekend at a secluded cabin deep in the mountains. Work had drained me, and the idea of a few days in quiet, surrounded by snow and trees, seemed perfect. The cabin was isolated, only reachable by a winding mountain road that cut through dense pine woods. Far from neighbors and without cell signal, it offered complete solitude, the kind that's a bit unsettling but seemed ideal for escaping. The first day was exactly what I wanted. A gentle snowfall dusted the cabin roof and covered the trees, creating a white blanket over everything. The place was cozy, with a stone fireplace and thick woolen blankets draped over the couch. I built a fire, settled in with a book, and soon the sound of crackling wood filled the room as I sank into relaxation. That evening, the weather shifted drastically. The light snowfall turned into a full-blown blizzard, snow swirling heavily around the cabin, hammering against the windows. By midnight, it was as if the entire cabin was wrapped in an endless sheet of white, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the howling wind. I had just started to doze off when I heard it, a faint knocking, rhythmic and slow, like someone tapping on the cabin's outer walls. At first, I brushed it off as a branch tapping against the window, but as I listened closer, I realized it was deliberate, moving around the cabin. I lay still, heart pounding as I heard it circle from one side of the cabin to the other. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it had started, and a deep silence took over again. I told myself it must have been the wind rattling something loose. I tried to sleep but couldn't shake the strange feeling that something, or someone, was just outside watching. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. Just as I was sinking into sleep, the sound started again, louder this time and closer. It wasn't at the window, it was at the front door. My pulse raced as I sat up, straining to hear. Someone was knocking, not loudly but insistently, as if testing to see if I'd respond. Gripping a flashlight, I crept toward the door, heart thundering as the knocking continued. When I got close, I froze. I didn't want to open the door, but the feeling of being watched was overpowering. After a moment's hesitation, I mustered the courage to look through the small glass window on the door. I gasped. There, just beyond the porch, stood a figure barely visible in the dark. It was tall, cloaked in a heavy, dark coat, its head bent slightly as if it were looking down, avoiding my gaze. I couldn't see a face, only the dark outline, motionless as the snow whipped around it. As I stared, the figure raised a hand and gave a slow, deliberate wave, as if acknowledging my presence. Then, just as suddenly, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stumbled back from the door, my mind racing. Who would be out here in the middle of a storm, alone, and why would they walk away without trying to speak? For the next hour, I stayed wide awake, every nerve on edge, convinced I'd hear the knocking again. But the night stayed silent, the blizzard swallowing up any sound. Eventually, I drifted into a fitful sleep, unable to shake the image of that figure standing outside my door. When dawn broke, I cautiously opened the door, looking for any sign of the figure from the night before. There was nothing, just a thick layer of untouched snow. But as I scanned the ground, I noticed footprints. They circled the cabin, moving from window to window before stopping at the door. My skin crawled. Whoever it was hadn't just been passing through, they'd been watching. Feeling rattled but trying to stay calm, I spent the day inside, avoiding the windows. I kept the fire burning, every little creak of the old cabin setting my nerves on edge. That night, I forced myself to go to bed, though I barely slept, every gust of wind outside convincing me the knocking would start again. By 3 a.m., I was lying there wide awake when the sound returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent, moving from one side of the cabin to the other as though someone, or something, was trying to find a way in. I felt trapped, vulnerable, knowing that out here no one would be able to hear me scream. Then came a soft click, almost inaudible over the wind, but unmistakable. I held my breath, straining to hear, and realized the sound was coming from the back door latch. I stumbled out of bed, grabbing the nearest object I could find, a fireplace poker, and crept toward the back of the cabin. The latch rattled again, softly, as though someone was testing the handle. I held my breath, waiting. The rattling stopped, replaced by silence so thick it seemed to press against my skin. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Outside the window, barely discernible in the faint light, was the figure from the night before. It was standing right at the window, face hidden in shadow, only inches from the glass. My heart pounded as I watched it raise a gloved hand and tap, slowly, on the window, each knock sending a cold shiver down my spine. I was paralyzed, staring at the shadowy figure, trying to understand what I was seeing. It stood there, motionless, just watching me as though waiting for a reaction. In a panic, I reached for my phone, but there was no service. Alone and with no way to call for help, I tried to calm myself, watching as the figure slowly retreated into the storm. The snow continued to fall, covering any trace of the encounter, as if it had never happened. Morning came, but I didn't wait to see the sun fully rise. I packed my things, threw them into the car, and left that cabin as fast as the snow-covered roads would allow. As I pulled away, I looked back one last time. There, barely visible in the tree line, was the dark figure, standing silently, watching as I drove away. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw that night. All I know is that it was waiting for something I was glad I hadn't stayed long enough to find out. Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.